Liverpool's docks know the sound of work. Winches, gulls, pallets, the cough of a diesel that refuses retirement. What they don't know is a scream that refuses to stop. For 3 days and 3 nights, a locked warehouse on a back quay poured a single human note into the wind. Not a siren, not a whistle, but the long, fraying ribbon of a throat that never seemed to breathe. Ship horns answered once and then stayed quiet. The gulls kept their distance. People who lived along the Mersey shut their windows and told each other stories. None of the stories involved a key. When the police cut the chain, the air inside slapped them. The chemical cold of old refrigeration lines, sour water, and something copper underneath. The floor was clean in the way a guilty kitchen is clean. Racks of shrink-wrapped goods stood in columns like a congregation. In the north wall, the intake louvers shivered as if they had nerves. Somewhere in the hangar, a speaker clicked, and the scream, still going, wavered like a hand had finally gotten tired. We don't do omens on this program. We do reasons. We will ask what kind of machinery can grow vowels, what kind of person runs a wire so a voice never gets to stop, and how long guilt thinks 3 days is. Our detective will measure echoes, peel tape from a panel that should have been sealed, and make a choice no one trains for. Cut the power and risk the evidence, or leave it running and risk a life. If you've ever stood at a cold door and thought you heard your name, bring a warmer coat. We're going inside. The scream won't wait. The scream rode the wind before the building did. Detective Isla Kerr heard it as a taut thread running through the gulls and diesel coughs. One unwavering human vowel, somewhere between plea and siren, the kind of sound the throat should not be able to hold. It seemed to thin and thicken as she and the fire crew turned the corner onto the back quay at Clarence Dock, as if the river itself were drawing it out with the tide. Warehouse 19 sat at the end of the quay like a sealed crate. Brick, iron lintels, a roll-up door with peeling white paint, and a smaller personnel door inset to the right. The padlock on the personnel door hung proud and whole, stamped with a custom seal that hadn't been snapped. "That's the one," the patrol sergeant said, rubbing his eyes. "Residents called it in Saturday. We've been trying to reach the owner since. It hasn't stopped." Isla stood at the threshold of 60 meters according to the wheel on her crime scene tape and listened. The pitch was steady enough to steady her breath against it. She lifted the little spectral app she never admitted to using, and the screen flickered with a bright band around 480 hertz, formant stacks blooming above like rungs. "Speech," her old lecturer's voice said in memory, or the ghost of it. The scream had the architecture of a vowel. Someone had taught the air to pronounce. "Right," she said. "No one crosses the line till we've got the cut on camera. Document the lock. Document the seal. We do not open anything before we've got power isolated. If this is refrigeration, I don't want a live ammonia line hissing in our faces." The fire brigade's cutter unit came forward as if at low tide. The camera clicked. The marker board flashed the time. The red LED winked on. The circular saw bit the chain in a spitting spray of light, and Isla could feel the scream through the soles of her boots now. The way pressure hums in concrete. When the chain fell like a dead snake, the scream did not falter, neither hoarse nor breathless, only there. The air that came out of Warehouse 19 slapped. Not warm, not rank in the way of rot, but a refrigerated cold with the sourness of meltwater and a copper echo in the sinuses, as if pennies had been rubbed into the ducting. Isla held her breath and counted to 3 while her eyes adjusted. A gray-blue wash lay over everything. Racks and columns, pallets wrapped in plastic that shone dully. A scuffed concrete aisle runs straight as a spine to the back wall. The scream blossomed from above, from a corroded ceiling speaker that looked like it had been installed when the Beatles were playing The Cavern. Interior at 4 to 6 degrees. The fire captain called after a quick thermometer poke. "Feels like there's a plant still spinning. Ammonia trace. Not enough to mask, but let's keep masks ready." "Merseyside CID Isla Kerr," Isla said into the scene recorder. "Entry made at," she stamped the time, "by fire and rescue with detective present. Padlock and seal intact prior to cut. Continuous scream audible from ceiling speaker upon entry. Visual on racks, pallets, aisle. No persons in immediate sight. There was a light in the corner that shouldn't have been on. A little orange bead of power glowed on the face of an old public address amplifier stacked on a wire rack near the office hatch. Even though the mains breaker by the door was tagged off by patrol, the red tag fluttered like a thin tongue. Wires ran from the amp like opportunistic roots. A mic lead that vanished into a foam windscreen, a pair of speaker lines that snake-laddered up a column to the ceiling unit, and, tucked behind the rack, something new and wrong. Isla crouched. Her breath rolled back at her through the mask. Battery. A marine battery box. Black, with a clipped-on inverter humming like an insect. Someone had cut the building out of the loop and made their own. On the concrete next to it sat a plastic stack chair with molded armrests, the sort you see in break rooms and village halls. Along the front edge of the seat and the shallow tray of plastic that joins seat to backrest, 10 or 12 deep, parallel gouges furrowed the plastic fingernail arcs that had bent and broken and still dug. They were positioned where a person would brace to stand or pull away. The floor around the rack was too clean, mopped to a dull sheen that did not carry the footsteps it should. "Get the exterior feeder," Isla said, low enough that the scream nearly ate her words. "Not just the internal breaker. We want the building dead for anything but this circuit. Then I want a bypass. We preserve whatever's feeding this amp, and we stage a controlled shutdown for documentation." "You want to end it?" the sergeant asked, hands tight on his belt. There was a hollow look around his eyes that said he hadn't slept well, not since this started. "I want to hear what the room sounds like when it stops," Isla said. "And I want to know if the scream changes when the battery's isolated. If it drops, it's live feed and we've got a duty of care. If it cuts like a tape, we've got a crime." She moved through the nearest aisle with her hands behind her back, the way her first mentor had taught her. No casual contact, no accidental prints. The shrink wrap crackled softly in the cold. Condensate beaded on the evaporator coils slung like a black ladder over the far wall and dripped in slow, patient intervals. Somewhere back and right, metal gave a gentle, intermittent clank as if a sheet were easing itself against a bracket with each minute of temperature shift. It set the scream into relief, like breath between sobs, except there was no breath. At the intake louvers on the north wall, she saw the first oddity outside of the amp. Slivers of foil, ordinary kitchen foil, had been glued to the slats at odd angles. Air sneaking past the partly closed veins set them to shiver, giving the airflow a rasp, a wet edge. If you were trying to make a voice sound like a throat and not a speaker, you might teach the vents to rasp. The tech from forensics, a woman with steady white eyelashes and a habit of humming under stress, slid in beside the amplifier and began shooting the connections. Close, closer, macro on the screw heads to catch any tool marks. She angled the light over the inverter and hissed. "Warm," which is obvious, I know, but there's an ambient heat bloom on the SD slot here. That's long-running electronics. She nodded toward the rack where a micro SD card poked like a limb in a trap. Over it, someone had slapped a label in black marker. 3D dot wave. Isla felt her shoulders creep up under her coat. Document the label. We don't touch it until the power is cut outside and we can copy it right protected. The sergeant came back shaking his head. Owner's number still dark. Name on the lease is Callum Price. We've got his supervisor on voicemail, Owen Stallard. Meter outside's on. Patrol says they tagged the breaker off Saturday. But your little lamp there doesn't care. Because it's not on the building, Isla said. It's on its own little heart. The fire crew pulled the exterior feeder, copper braid under lock, and radioed confirmation. The building's hum sank. The evaporator's fan coasted. The scream ran on, indifferent. "Right," Isla said, and nodded to the tech. "Isolate the battery. Don't disconnect anything else. Kill the inverter first." Gloved fingers pinched the switch. The inverter gave a petulant beep. The orange bead on the amp died, and for the first time in 3 days, Isla could feel the numbers in the cold of her bones. The scream collapsed. It didn't wind down. It didn't crack. It died like a light. In the sled of silence after, the warehouse became a place again. Water dripped. Metal clicked. The wind threaded itself through the louvers and shook the foil in a softer, more honest voice. The windy hiss of a lung that belonged to the dock and no one else. The silence revealed other sounds they had not noticed. The faint whir of a tiny fan inside the inverter cooling to a stop, the soft settle of air pressure in the ducts, the raw scrape of someone's throat in the back just releasing a held breath. The mask of noise had fallen, and beneath it was a room that had been tidied by someone who knew where the eyes go. The mop lines swirled in easy circles around the amplifier rack and chair, leaving the concrete darker by shade where it had dried. The edges against pallet feet were too neat. Isla stepped to the clock and keypad bolted by the office hatch. The screen was basic and stubborn. It showed a last entry stamped Friday 5:42. It was Monday. She touched the plastic with the back of her glove, as if heat might tell her something. Nothing. On the concrete by the service door, an exit that led toward the alley, they found a single glove. Left hand. Nitrile on the outside, powder bloom in the creases. Inside, a cotton liner turned back like a smaller skin. It sat as if someone had pulled out of it while their hand was slick. A line of faint smears tracked away from it toward the aisle and then stopped in mop arcs. The smell of copper was stronger here, not blood-strong, but the ghost of it, as if the cold had sealed it into the pores of the floor. "Sergeant," Isla said, "put out the missing person cross-check for Leona Pace, temp on the warehouse books. She was last to badge in Friday according to that log. If she's at home, I'll buy you a pint and call this a prank with a sick budget. And if she's not, then someone taught a machine to scream because they needed time," Isla said. Her voice sounded bigger in the quiet. "And I want to know what they wanted to do with it." She walked the perimeter, marking where cameras should have been and where the lines had been cut and reattached. The DVR cage in the office blinked like a fish tank. Reset, overwrite, loop. Someone had made the weekend into a treadmill. Above her, the ceiling speaker hung still as an eye with its lid closed. In the hush, the building seemed to wait for its word to come back. The river pushed against the quay stones. The gulls began, tentatively, to remember their own language. "Scene secured," Isla said to the recorder finally. "Primary anomalies documented. External padlock and seal intact at initial entry. Interior temperature 4 to 6 degrees. Ammonia trace present. PA amplifier powered by independent battery/inverter despite mains off. Chair adjacent bearing deep fingernail gouges. Floor recently mopped in the immediate area. Controlled shutdown executed at exterior feeder followed by inverter isolation. Continuous vocalization ceased instantly upon inverter cutoff. Next actions. Preserve PA circuit for image and audio capture. Recover and clone labeled micro SD without alteration. Conduct full sweep for blood trace and forced entries. Begin interviews with owner Callum Price and supervisor Owen Stallard. She clicked the recorder off and let the silence occupy her for one more breath. The wind caught the foil at the louvers and for a second made a thin, almost human rasp. It was nothing like the scream. It sounded like the building clearing its throat. The silence made some of the uniforms sway, as if they'd been bracing against a wind that finally dropped. Isla used the lull like a scalpel. "No one moves the rack," she said. "We shoot and diagram first, then clone. Every cable gets a number, every lug a close-up, every scuff its own frame." The forensics tech, Hollis, white lashes, steady, worked the scene like a clockmaker. She dusted the amplifier's face with oblique light and murmured, "Heat bloom on the micro SD slot and the inverter vents. And here," she angled the lamp. The plastic round the card port had yellowed a shade, a faint crescent of discoloration, the kind electronics earn from days of load. "This has been running long, not just hours." Isla nodded the scribe over and dictated the initial map. PA amplifier, make and model, battery box, marine leisure type, inverter off the shelf, consumer grade, switch in off. Speaker line, twin core, runs to ceiling cone in Bay B, row 3. Mic lead, runs to hardwired mic mount, windscreen intact. Plastic chair adjacent to rack showing patterned gouges consistent with fingernail scoring. 18 distinct channels visible. Measure pitch and depth. Floor immediately around shows mop cleaning. Circular arcs dried. The building's benign sounds, drips, thermal ticks, settled into their own rhythm. The clank came again, farther back. a sheet of metal expanding and popping against its fasteners every few minutes. On the north wall, the louvers whispered without the amplifier's mask, the foil slivers shivering in a high, thin hiss. The cold persisted, honest as a meat locker's. Isla's breath made the inside of her mask damp. She went to the keypad again, photographing the LCD's stubborn figures. Last entry 542 FRI. She had the scribe record the date and the now. We're at Monday. No other badges since. Cross-check with payroll for scheduled staff. Start your calls, owner, supervisor, any temp agencies. I want to know who would have been here at that hour. Hollis lifted the SD card with tweezers after a sequence of stills. The label, in tidy block letters, read 3D.wave. She winced theatrically, naming a file 3D and then cooking it in a freezer. Charming. Static and cold do strange things to the moral center, Isla said dryly. Clone it. Write protect the original. Before we take anything apart, I want 10 minutes of room tone from where the speaker is. Place a test mic exactly beneath it, same height as the chair's headrest, and record. If we end up in court answering why witnesses heard one thing and we heard another, I want to show the difference between the two rooms, amplified versus unamplified. They set the tripod by the chair, extended to the height of an average seated head, and let the recorder breathe. In the quiet, the evaporator coil's drip became a metronome. Tick, tick. Somewhere in the duct, a damper shifted with a leathered sigh. Hollis gave Isla the thumbs up. Rolling. The scribe returned, her phone pressed to her shoulder. Supervisor Stallard on the line, ma'am. Said he changed the camera overwrite interval on Friday because the drives were full and skipping. Also says the owner, Mr. Price, is abroad. He can't reach him either. Good. Log it. Ask Stallard if he can join us for a chat today. Isla's voice did not move. And get control to push the missing person alert with emphasis on Leona Pace, temp worker. Last badge Friday 542. Ask her emergency contacts when they last heard her voice. Not just saw a message. They bagged the glove by the service door. Isla stood over it before it went into paper. Left hand, nitrile outer, cotton liner. She could picture the way those liners fit. A soft, snug second skin under the rubber for warmth, the kind warehouse hands wore when the cold got into the bones. Swab both layers, Isla said. Exterior for touch DNA, interior for shed skin cells. Check the cuff for any undernail blood. Photograph the way it lies in relation to the mop arcs. Hollis brought the cloned SD card over on a little tray like a sacrament. Clone complete. MD5 matches. The originals in a Faraday sleeve. Do you want a quick spectrogram on site or wait for the lab? We wait, Isla said, though she was itching to know. We don't risk corrupting a thing. That card is going to sit pretty until a lab tech with gloves like a saint breathes on it. Meanwhile, document the inverter, serial, vendor sticker, any purchase labels. I want to know if this came from a chandlery down the road or imported off the internet. She stepped to the office hatch, peered at the DVR cage again. The cheap unit blinked in a comforting way, as if being present were virtuous. On the floor just inside the hatch, the pattern of mop arcs changed. Tight, nervous circles near the desk, as if the cleaner had been interrupted and returned. Shoot this, Isla said. Look how the loops overlay. We'll see if they hid something under a neat motif. They moved deeper down the central aisle. The clank announced itself again, slightly left. Hollis wrapped her knuckles against the metal of a cold room door halfway down. Its latch was bolted back by design. The safety release on the inside meant you could never lock it by accident. But the door frame bore faint, fresh drilled dust at the top corner, and two screw heads peered like eyes from the casing. Don't touch, Isla said, heart adopting a new rhythm. Photograph that latch. Then check the other side. If someone added holding power, it'll be wired hot. And Hollis, listen. They both put their ears to the scene. In the quiet, there was only the steady, dampened hush of air that had been cold for a long time. No scrape of foot, no shallow panic breath. If it had ever held one, the room held only the memory. Control chimed through on the sergeant's radio. Update for DCI Kerr. MP check on Leona Pace. No answer at listed mobile since Friday morning. Employer confirms she was rostered Friday 5 a.m. onset. Mother reports last message late Thursday. Early call tomorrow at the docks. No further contact. She's not at home. Phone pings last at Dock Road mast, early Friday. Isla looked at the chair again, at the arcs her mind had started to measure without permission. The way a torso might bend if a hand on the backrest pushed a face down toward the mic. She caught herself and forced the picture back into boxes. Distances, angles, pressures. Logged, she said into the recorder. Leona Pace. Last known location aligns with Warehouse 19 in the early hours of Friday. No subsequent communications. Glove and badge log consistent with her presence on site. Hollis had the inverter's bottom plate shooting now. Serial scraped a bit, but I can still make out a retailer's sticker. Looks like a chandlery on Dock Road. We'll pull their CCTV and receipts. Do. Isla turned slow on her heel, letting her eyes catch edges. Any signs our breaker tag was faked? The sergeant held up the tag from the mains cabinet. The zip tie pinched a different way than patrol usually did. The plastics were newer than the dust under the cabinet lip. Printed Friday's date, he said. Fonts a smidge off. We'll compare to stock. Someone wanted it to look like we'd switched them off, Isla said. Her voice stayed flat, but something flared behind her ribs. And someone wanted the building to stay on in ways that we wouldn't notice. The 10-minute ambience rolled to a stop. Hollis capped the recorder, labeled it with a neat hand, and tucked it beside the Faraday sleeve in a Pelican case. We've got our baseline, she said. Do you want to power the amplifier for a short capture of the loop itself, now that we've documented? We can run it off the battery without touching any settings, lift a line-level feed into the recorder, and kill it again. One take. Isla looked up at the ceiling speaker, its cone a dead flower. She looked at the chair. The idea of bringing the sound back made her jaw clench. But evidence is evidence, and juries believe their ears. We'll do it, she said. Wire in parallel so we don't break the chain. No alterations. 2 minutes rolling, not a second more. They brought the inverter up. The orange bead glowed. The scream returned like a light in the head. Instant. Full. Burrowing. For 2 minutes Isla watched the recorder burn its blue bar forward while her body remembered the way tension nests between the shoulder blades. The loop did not gasp or waver. It was a perfect, engineered horror. When Hollis cut the power, the sound vanished again. Less a mercy than a subtraction. File captured, Hollis said, voice small. Level peaking just under 0. Clean. Good, Isla said. Her throat was tight and dry. Pack it. We're done with the amp until lab. As they sealed the Pelican case, the scribe came back with a printout of the initial call logs. Neighbors started phoning Saturday at 8:10, then on the hour after that. Some reported whispers under the scream at night. Could be fatigue, could be vent noise. Or a second track, Isla said, almost to herself. We'll let the lab tell us what's in that file. She walked once more to the cold room door, rested her gloved fingers on the frame near the new screws, and stared at the line where steel met steel. A decision throbbed underneath the procedural surface. To open now and risk smearing whatever lay under the latch, or to hold, build the chain, and go in with every camera and reagent primed. Hold, she said finally, to the team and to herself. We've frozen the scream. Now we freeze the room. Outside, the Mersey lifted and dropped against the quay like a big animal breathing. Inside, the foil on the louvers ticked a little, as if a disciplined whisper were rehearsing. Control's voice came thin over the radio. Chandlery confirms selling an inverter to a man matching Owen's Stallard Friday before dawn. Right? Isla said, tasting the copper of the room again. Then next we find out what else the scream was wearing. The lab still smelled faintly of coffee and isopropyl when Isla and Hollis slid the Pelican case onto the counter. Soundproofing tiles climbed the walls like black honeycomb. 3 calibrated monitors glowed a low, pre-dawn blue. On the main screen, an engineer named Deva Patel rolled his chair closer and laced his fingers behind his head, as if preparing to watch a storm come in. You brought me a ghost, Dava said, unsealing the Faraday sleeve with the gentleness of a ritual. Let's see whose sheets it's wearing. He cloned the microSD to the lab server with a fussy thoroughness Isla liked, hash before, hash after, a sign checksum that looked like a run of obsidian beads. The directory structure was Spartan. A root folder called PA with 3 files, 3D.wave, priming.wave, mask.wave, and a system folder that screamed generic firmware. Dava lifted 3D.wave into the DAW. The spectral view irised open. A bright bar at around 480 Hz, then stacked, ghostly formants, smooth as lathe work. Not a live mic to speaker, Dava murmured. This is a render or an edit. See how the top harmonics don't wander? A throat trembles. Electricity doesn't. And here, he zoomed at the 23-minute mark. A faint glitch line nicked the spectrogram like a scratch in glass. Another, precisely 23 minutes and 14 seconds later. He dropped markers. They marched across the file at even distances. Inverter recharge cycle, Hollis said. We heard the little fan spool. The loop itself is 92 seconds. Dava went on. Hard cut to frame. No ambient pre-roll. Whoever made this wanted endurance, not realism. But, listen. He unmuted the lower bands. Beneath the clean, plank-steady scream, there was a breath that wasn't a breath. A combed hiss, the signature of air pushing across edges. Louvers, Isla said. Louvers, Dava agreed. You told me about foil slivers. They're in here. This bass track is a woman's sustained vowel process to sit at your 480 fundamental, likely auto-tuned to hold it, then layered with a narrowband recording of your room vent so the ear hears throat, not cone. Clever. Dirty clever. He brought up the waveform of 3D.wave, its uniform shoulder, its lack of decay, and let it ride for 10 seconds. The room felt colder, even with the amp off. Dava killed the playback and pulled priming.wave into view. Neighbors said they heard whispers under the long note, Isla said. I want them identified, or I want them debunked. Please don't stop. Dava read from the spectral captions the DAW had drawn from sibilance. He isolated the mid-highs and let it slip at a whispering volume. The words came in little bruised phrases, each with a chew in the consonants that suggested an exhausted jaw. Please, don't stop, don't stop, stop. He cut it off and glanced up. It's not powerful enough to carry through walls. But if you were already rattled by the long scream and you opened a window or stood in the alley, the duct might feed you this. Sprinkle a little suggestion and you'll have crowd reports for belief. Was she alive when it was recorded? Hollis asked, more to the screen than to anyone else. Dava's hands hovered over the keyboard, then stilled. I can tell you the mic was close to a human mouth at some point. There are plosive shadows and lip smack residues in 3D.wave's first generation, very faint. But someone has edited with compression and EQ to flatten that into the long line. There's also a small pop where someone's chin might have brushed a mixed suspension ring. I can see the resonance fingerprint of a particular cheap plastic, windshield fiber, maybe. If you give me the physical mic, I can try to match. We seized a mount with a foam windscreen, Hollis said. We'll bring it. Dava nodded, already writing a chain of custody request. Mask.wave, he said, moving on. The third file spectrum bloomed like a low fog. A broad smear centered at 50 Hz with harmonic ladders. Machine hum. He blended it under the scream track and the whisper. It turned the horror into industry. The way a refrigerator's song makes a kitchen sound alive and impersonal. Industrial camouflage, Isla said. If a constable steps inside for 2 seconds and thinks machinery, they back out to call the owner, and the clock keeps running. Dava toggled on the software's provenance tab. The DAW recognized certain edit patterns like fingerprints of tools. Hello, Audacity, he said, half amused, half disgusted. Default crossfades, razor cuts at 0 crossings. Project metadata shows Friday morning timestamps. The machine name on the cached export header reads, wait for it, Owen Stallard HP. Hollis exhaled. Well then. Don't say well then, Isla said, though her pulse did what pulses do when puzzle pieces find teeth. Say, Mr. Stallard, We have your workstation's paw prints. I'll write this up so the Crown can understand it without learning a new language, Davis said. Bottom line, layered construction. A human source bracketed and tuned, room vent rasp glued on top to fake throats, optional whispers to salt the witnesses, and a low hum to excuse the whole thing as plant noise. Confidence score, high. Chain of custody? Isla asked, eyes on the checksum window. You're good, Davis said. Clones are clean. Originals untouched. You'll get your report. Exhibits A through C. Back at Warehouse 19 that afternoon, Isla walked the circuit with fresh ears. Without the loop, the place was indecently ordinary. A rivulet of condensate nosed across the floor and kissed the mop arcs, making their pattern brighter for a second before dulling. She stood at the louvers and blew gently. The foil slivers answered in a tiny, mean gossip. Someone had tuned them by ear. Angles differed by degrees, spacing by an inch here, 2 there, until the rasp carried the suggestion of a throat clearing. It was the kind of detail you don't find in a manual. You find it by standing in a cold room for too long, trying things, listening. Photograph each foil slat with a ruler, she said. We'll need to put it back exactly as found if a defense expert wants to hear the room. Also collect samples of the adhesive. They cracked open the mains cabinet with gloves and shot the tag. The font on the OFF note was wrong, the plastic slicker than the old ones in the patrol car's glove box. Hollis lifted the zip ties nub under a lens. Cut with a different crimper, she said. Patrol uses a flat tooth. This has a star. So a forged tag, Isla said. Make a note. The service alley behind the building held all the habits of the weekend. A flattened patch of grass where a tarp had lain, a faint diesel bloom, a scuff where a cable had crossed the sill. Generator, Hollis said, pointing to the shadow print. Ran cool, then hot, then gone. We'll pull CCTV on the back fence. They went to the little chandlery on Dock Road together. Not because Isla expected theater, but because she wanted to see the clerk's eyes when she said the name. The bell over the door chimed like the smallest buoy at sea. The clerk, a man with hands washed pale by rope burn and salt, took one look at the serial number Hollis slid across and nodded. Sold that early Friday. Cold morning. Lad said he needed an inverter for a caravan heater. Took a leisure battery too. Had the look of a night shift gone on too long. Paid card. He tapped keys and printed the receipt. The name came out neat and legal. Owen Stallard. Cameras? Isla asked. 2, the clerk said. 1 over the till, 1 on the door. They'll show him enough to make his mum wince. They took the files on a thumb drive and the printout in an evidence sleeve. Back in the car, the Riverside light went mute with cloud. Isla called the number on the lease. It rang twice and jumped to a glossy voice that tried to sound both busy and benevolent. Mr. Price, Isla said to the recorded dead air. Detective Chief Inspector Isla Kerr, Merseyside CID. We are in your unit at Clarence Dock regarding an ongoing investigation. Call me. Today. Price did call 2 hours later, with a call quality that sounded suspiciously like a quiet room in Liverpool pretending to be abroad. I'm in Valencia, he said, and named hotels she could verify later. My supervisor, Owen, has the keys. What's the issue? My insurance will want prompt notification if there's a police closure. Your unit broadcast a scream for 3 days, Isla said. We cut your lock this morning. We found a private power arrangement keeping a PA loop going despite the mains being off. Your cameras were set to overwrite every 72 hours. Your last staff badge is Friday before dawn. There was a stage pause. That's unfortunate, Price said carefully. I was not aware. I've been away since Wednesday. If Owen has done something irregular, we'll be speaking to Mr. Stallard shortly, Isla said. I'd prefer to do it before you do. I'm sure you're doing your best, Price said, his voice oiled against liability. As I say, I'm abroad. Isla ended the call with the museum care you give a piece of brittle glass. On the quay, the tide had turned. The water slipped seaward with a cold hurry. She looked back at the line of roll-up doors along the old brick, at the collected lives of a dozen small businesses, each with its own stink and hum. Price swears he's away, Hollis said, watching her face. He might as well have sworn on salt, Isla said. She turned toward the cold room door with its fresh screws and its patient seam. Get me Stallard, and bring me a borescope for the latch casing. If the scream was a costume, then somewhere behind it is a body that wasn't. In the aisles quiet after the generator talk and the polite lies, the metal sheet inside the warehouse clanked again, just once, like a breath someone left on a recording by mistake. The drag mark toward the cold room drain was only visible when the light came low, and it was coming low now, the day thinning. It didn't carry blood, carried intention. By late afternoon, Isla had the 3 kinds of keys laid out in her head. Metal, digital, and habit. The metal ones open doors. The digital ones open times. Habits open people. They brought Owen Stallard into interview 2 at Canning Place with his high-vis jacket folded on his knees like a child at church. He was mid-30s, dock-born by the vowel cut, a tidy beard that he must have trimmed that morning, and a foreman's impatience leaking through his politeness. He kept rubbing the side of his thumb with his forefinger, a worry-stone gesture without a stone. The duty solicitor touched her pad. My client has come voluntarily. Thank you, Isla said. She let the recorder tick through its preamble. Time, date, place, names, and then set the initial weight down gently. Mr. Stallard, we're investigating events at Warehouse 19 between early Friday and this morning. We have some questions about the public address system, the power arrangement feeding it, and the CCTV configuration. Owen cleared his throat. We had trouble with the DVR filling. I set it to loop faster. That's not a crime. It can be, Isla said, still gentle. When it looks like you meant to erase a weekend. On Friday before dawn. Did you purchase a leisure battery and an inverter from Dock Road Chandlery? He blinked, fought not to look at his solicitor, lost the fight, then nodded. We've had outages before. The alarm panel throws a wobbly when the mains trip. I wanted to keep things stable, which you accomplished not by feeding the alarm, Isla said, but by wiring a battery and inverter to a PA amplifier driving a ceiling speaker. He set his jaw. There were kids about thieving copper off roofs. Price wanted deterrence. He told me to make noise. That's my job. Do as I'm told. Is it your job to record your colleague screaming? Hollis asked from the corner, voice flat. The solicitor sat up a little. Owen's fingers stopped rubbing. It wasn't like, look, we've got loss, right? Every week. Price is on at me about shrinkage. I thought if it sounded like there was someone in there, the bastards would think twice. The scream was a stock clip. You can buy anything off the internet. Priming.wave, Isla said, just to watch the way his eyes reacted to a file name. They gave a flinch, a tiny one. And mask.wave. You layered your deterrent like a cake. Did you bake it at home or at the office? He swallowed. At the office. Before hours. I wired the mic so I could test the system. He looked at the table. I tried some things. The vents make a nice rasp when the louvers are half shut. You can make it sound more human. Who else was present? Isla asked. Leona Pace badged in at 5:42 on Friday. Did you see her? He took a long time to answer. When he did, his words were careful, dead level. She came in early. Always did Fridays to prep manifests before the rest. I had the amp out in the aisle. I asked her to sit on the chair so I could set levels. Did she want to? Hollis asked. She wanted to go home early, Owen said, too quickly. We all did. She sat, that's all. He rubbed his thumb again. I made a stupid joke. Give us a scream, I said, like the telly. She laughed. Then she did one, just a little, for a second. I didn't make her. It was a joke. Then I put on the stock file. I mixed it. The rest is your story, isn't it? Price said to run the deterrent. I set it up so it wouldn't kill the freezers. The police didn't come till Monday. The room cooled. Isla sat with the quiet. Where is Leona now, Mr. Stallard? I don't know, he said, looking at the table. I left before 7. I came back at 10. The scream was running and it sounded fine. I did a round and went to the yard. That's all. Did you change the DVR overwrite interval to 72 hours? Yes, he said, because the drives were erroring. Did you forge a breaker tag on the mains cabinet to make it look as if Patrol had switched the power off? He looked up hot. No, I'm not stupid. That's a popular lie, Isla said. She let him inhale it. We will be going through your devices and your workstation. We already have the project file for the audio loop with Friday morning timestamps and your machine name stamped across the headers. If your joke turns into a charge, it will be because your deterrent became a prison. Do you understand? The solicitor touched his sleeve. We'll be answering no more questions today, she said briskly. Voluntary ends here. Of course, Isla said, and thanked them like a hostess seeing off a guest who had spilled gravy and pretended it hadn't happened. She didn't get Price in a room. Price hovered on a phone, his signal obligingly bad, his tone professionally appalled. He sent her a PDF of his boarding pass, wide white margins, crisp type. She marked it for verification. Your insurance policy covers spoilage when civil authority closes your premises, she said. On Friday morning at 9:12 you emailed your broker. Disturbance at unit? Police involved? How did you know there would be a police involvement? It's a port, Price said. If there's noise and neighbors, police come. I was covering my bases. It's what a prudent businessman does. Did you ask your prudent supervisor to create prolonged, unavoidable noise? Isla asked. Absolutely not, Price said smoothly. If Owen has done anything without authorization, I'll cooperate fully. Good, Isla said. Bring yourself fully to Liverpool. Rhea Doyle arrived in denim and a mood, a small woman whose hands looked like she could thread a needle with them while swearing. She ran Unit 20 next door, a cold storage subcontractor who had feuded with Price about a shared vent stack for 6 months, if council email threads were a weather report. You and Price, Isla said in the front office where the tea was always bad, have complained about each other to anyone who would listen. Because he's a chancer, Rhea said, arms folded. Cuts corners, runs the plant hot, lets water sit under pallets so I get mold complaints from my clients. Friday morning I come in and his unit is screaming like a banshee. I call environmental health, then the council, then the police. My tools went missing at some point over the weekend. A reciprocating saw, my butcher's saw, gone. Lock on my cage was cut tidy. You'll tell me what you find with it on, won't you? If we find it, I'll tell you what it did, Isla said. Where were you Friday night? At home with my sister and her kids watching telly they shouldn't, Rhea said. You can ask her. She'll tell you I shouted at the ads and everyone else fell asleep on the furniture. Hollis had dug up the security contractor by then, a man with a batch of contracts stitched into his jacket like medals. He had the embarrassed look of someone who had sold a simple system into a complicated problem. They asked me to set the DVR to loop, he said, palms open. I told them that means you lose old footage fast. Stallard signed the paperwork. He said they were having trouble with dropouts. Looping was better than gaps. Is your default overwrite interval 72 hours? Isla asked. No, he said. Ours is 14 days, then incrementally purge. 72 hours was a manual change. Done Friday. There's a log. There were texts on Leona's phone that had backed up to her mother's plan. Thursday night, a photo of a thermos and a sandwich. A line, early call tomorrow at the docks. A final one at 5:30 Friday morning. He wants me to stay late. Doors are weird. No reply. The timestamp bit like frost. Isla walked the warehouse again at last light with those 4 voices braided around the aisle. Owen's half-truths, Price's silky distance, Rhea's salt, Leona's simple line. She had Hollis dust the plastic chair's backrest where a head would press if a hand on the skull pushed. Under the oblique light, a crescent kiss of matte showed where lipstick had printed and smeared. Dull cherry against the plastic sheen. An old shade with a name that sounded like a street. They took it like a relic. Deep gouges on the front edge, lip print on the backrest, Hollis said, writing without looking. The way a body fights if it's held down to a mic, or if someone played a stupid joke that turned into a fight, Isla said. We don't have the body. We don't even have proof of life past 6 o'clock. What we have is the negative space around a person. The scream filled it. Now it's our job to see the shape. They opened the DVR logs and printed the last 24 hours of usable entry before the loop began chewing. The cameras, vestibules, the aisle head, the office hatch were all present and boring until 5:41 Friday. Then the office cam flickered, froze, and resumed with a new baseline. Loop interval shifted, quality down. Overwrite clock reset. Someone had stood under it and pressed buttons until it made a different kind of memory. The vestibule camera showed Owen arriving a hair before 5, a box tucked under his arm. It showed Leona at 5:42 with a thermos. It showed no one else, because the rest had been sacrificed to the god of free disk space. Near the mid-aisle, at a junction where the concrete wore a different polish from years of wheels, an almost invisible line curved toward the cold room, a subtle track darker than the floor. In the low light it read as a drag mark, not recent enough to be wet, not wide enough to be a pallet skid. It ended at the floor drain by the cold room's threshold, a square of black metal with a squared spiral cut into it like a maze. There was no blood to please the eye. There was only the suggestion of weight that had learned the floor and gone that way. "Mark it," Isla said. "Luminol tonight. We'll find what the mop was too short to reach." On her way out, she paused at the louvers and plucked one foil sliver free with tweezers. It crackled as if it resented her. "People with keys," she said to Hollis as they stepped into the quay dusk. Owen had the keys to power and to a voice. Price had keys to money and timing. Ria's keys went missing to make a story. Leona had a badge and a text that said doors are weird. "And what did the scream key open?" Hollis asked. 3 days, Isla said. "Enough time to do something else." She looked back down the aisle. The cold made the racks look like pews. The drain was a font with wrong water. Somewhere a sheet of metal clanked the slow beat of thermal change. The scream was gone, and yet the room felt tuned to it, ready to sing again if someone slipped the right card into the right slot. "Tomorrow," Isla said, more to the door than to Hollis. "We open the cold room with every camera we own and find out what the scream was hiding when it kept everyone busy." They opened the cold room like a sarcophagus. For cameras, 2 on tripods and 2 body-worn, captured the first breath of stale chill as Hollis backed the screws from the jam plate and pried the casing with a nylon wedge. The heads had been driven recently, bright zinc, unbruised. When the plate came off, the story hid in plain copper. An electromagnet bolted to the frame, its armature sunk into the door skin. Wires snaked through the casing and down the wall in a neat surface trunk to the same private circuit that fed the inverter. "Hold open becomes hold shut," Hollis said, voice fogging in the cold. "Once it pulls, that's that." "Wired to your battery," Isla said. So the building's OFF wouldn't help. Whoever fitted it wanted isolation from the grid and the power to lock a person in regardless. They photographed the magnet, the armature, the wiring, the fresh drill shavings glittering like fish scales in the seam. Then Hollis clipped the leads and bagged the screws, each in its own envelope, each with a number and a place. The door itself swung easily after the magnet lost its bite. Inside, white panels, condensation rivulets, a wire shelving unit scabbed with frost at the joints. The air felt like a held breath that had outlived its owner. On the ceiling, over the evaporator coils, the familiar slow drip marked time. It had been 4 to 6 degrees in the warehouse. Inside here the cold had bitten deeper. Isla could have believed in cleanliness if not for the way it shone. It was the shine of something wiped with purpose. "Lights," Isla said, and the tech raised a pair of LED panels, flood-soft and uncontaminating. "Trajectories first." Hollis misted the corners with Blue Star and killed the room lights. The LEDs went down to their lowest setting. For a heartbeat, there was only breathing and the small domestic sigh of the coils. Then the corners bloomed with stars, tiny, fine sprays fanning out from upper junctions where wall met ceiling. They formed the pattern Isla had learned to read in her bones. The angel wings of a misted impact, not from a floor-level fight but from an event higher up. "Fine fan," Hollis said, almost clinically cheerful in the way some people get when the work confirms them. Overhead mist, no pooling below. I'd say backspatter from a blow or a cut, not a projectile. A height problem, victim lower, event above. There, Isla said, pointing at the latch face where a smear had escaped the mop's literacy. A pale crescent in the blue star that lifted when the light caught it. Someone's hands here, braced and sliding. The shelf by the door had a bent brace at knee height, the steel cocked a few degrees off square, the way it goes when a full-grown person uses it as leverage to throw weight at a door that refuses to learn. The floor around the brace showed a scuff that had been mop-thin but not clever. Below the latch, the rubber grommet over the drain had a slightly newer shade to it than the surrounding floor. It had been lifted, replaced, lifted again. Gloves on everything, Isla said, though everyone already was. We lift the grommet last. Hollis turned to the evaporator coils and dusted them with oblique light. There, in the dull shine of aluminium fins, a smear that fattened with the angle, skin oil. 5 short ovals in a row, irregular because cold makes clumsy. Fingertips that had tried to find purchase and had found only metal. Hollis lifted each with a kit that looked like magic to people who hadn't seen it before. Gel lifters that took the print of a print the way a leaf takes frost. Fingers to fins, Hollis said. We'll see if they're good for comparison. At the very least, they'll tell us warmth met cold there. Isla crouched at the grommet. The drain cover itself was a square with a squared spiral cut in it. A maze of right angles. Inside the spiral lay a darkness that wasn't just absence of light. It had depth, the way night does at the bottom of a lock. She touched the grommet with tweezers and lifted. It made a small kiss as it let go. Trap first, Isla said. They snaked a clear tube down and pulled up the first draft into a sterile jar. The fluid looked like meltwater with a glass of iron held near it. Floating in it were things that didn't belong to pipes. A long, pale strand of hair coiled like a question mark. Flecks of white that might have been detergent residue or something that used to be soft tissue. A sheaf of lint that under the handheld microscope resolved into cotton fuzz. Short, staple-length fibers, the kind found in glove liners. Hair, Hollis said. We'll go mitochondrial unless you give me a brush and a miracle. Cotton fiber. And what's that, little gel beads? They were translucent cylinders no larger than grains of couscous. Some collapsed, some still swollen. Hollis fished 3 out with a glass pipette and tapped them onto a slide. Under the scope, they showed their nature. Superabsorbent polymer beads, some tinged faintly yellow, some with a pink ghost. SAP beads, Hollis said. Toy gel, soil conditioner, or the inside of those cold packs you crack. Why down a drain? Because if you had a victim pressing her mouth to the door gap to try to breathe or shout, Isla said, hearing the shape of it while hating the picture. And you didn't want her to get leverage there, you might seed the gap with polymer loaded with bitterant or capsaicin. It would swell with condensate and burn her lips. Deny the seal. Deny the breath. Hollis looked at her with a flat compassion. I'll test for denatonium and capsaicin. They photographed the drain cover in situ, then lifted it. The throat of the pipe showed the usual film where kitchens lie, a gray slickness. But here, smeared along one side in a thin, reluctant crescent, was something else, faint like the memory of a color, but there. They swabbed it. On the underside of the cover, caught in the corners of the squared spiral, 2 short blonde hairs clung like threads, refusing to go through the needle's eye. Bag the cover, Isla said. We're beyond coincidence. The shelf brace creaked when Hollis tested it with a gauge. It'll give you a few centimeters if you throw your hip, she said. Enough to make the door shake and the magnet sing. But the magnet would win. Unless the power failed, Isla said, which it wasn't going to. They swept the cold room floor with luminol again, this time in long, patient sheets. Faint arcs came up where a mop had turned and turned, losing heart at the edges. At the very back, near the coils, a fine spray dotted low on the wall at calf height. The signature of a saw cutting something that could not be bent, the droplets tiny and evenly spaced, thrown by regular motion. Recipe saw pattern, Hollis said, and the cheer had gone from her lab voice. Tooth pitch at we'll measure later, but I'd bet my lunch on a butcher's model. If Ria's missing one, we have a shopping list. They found a shallow gouge in the resin floor where a blade had kissed by mistake, a little U-shaped trough with a shine to it that fresher resin lacks. They cast it before they left it, because even mistakes can be measured and set against a catalog. Anything else? Isla asked, and the question felt too large for the room. Lip prints, Hollis said, back at the chair outside the door. Under chemical light, the dull cherry on the backrest resolved into a full top and bottom pattern with tiny cracks in the pigment where a mouth had been pressed hard and then slid. Hollis photographed it like a miniature landscape, ridge lines, valleys, before lifting a partial onto tape. We'll match to a shade if we can. The old brands have their own libraries. They packed the cold room out of themselves and into evidence. Swabs, casts, lifters, the electromagnet's face with a faint crescent of rust where it had kissed the armature. When they stepped back into the main aisle, the ordinary warehouse seemed indecent again, like a hall where a ceremony had happened and the chairs were being put back as if nothing had. Primary scene is this room, Isla said into the recorder, her breath a ghost in the air. Blood mist at ceiling corners consistent with backspatter from close-range blows or cutting. Floor drain shows hair, cotton glove fibers, superabsorbent polymer beads likely loaded with irritants. Shelf brace bent consistent with attempts to force door. Evaporator coils bearing oily fingertip traces. An electromagnet installed externally to hold door shut while the inverter kept power to the lock independent of mains. We have probable evidence of dismemberment by reciprocating saw. She paused, eyes on the spiral of the drain. We do not have a body. Outside, the quay had turned to tin in the late light. The Mersey moved with an energy that didn't care for stories. Isla leaned on the brick by the personnel door and let the cold climb her sleeves. Behind her, the louvers whispered through their foil teeth. Next, she said to Hollis, we follow the drain, interceptor tank first. If they gave the scream 3 days, they gave the water time too. Hollis nodded, the pelican case heavy in her hands. And the beads? She asked. Test them for bitterant and capsaicin, Isla said. If they sting, they tell us a lot about what someone expected to happen to Leona's mouth. She looked back into the cold room one last time before they taped it. The neat shelves, the bent brace, the square black maze of the drain. It had the cleanliness of apology. Somewhere a sheet of metal gave its tired, intermittent clank. You could convince yourself it was a heartbeat if you wanted. Isla did not. Seal it, she said, and the tape went across the door like a line drawn under a sentence that wasn't finished. Time is a tool. Used right, it cuts cleaner than steel. Isla laid the weekend out on brown paper, a dockside chronometer dismantled, every wheel labeled, every tooth accounted for. Hollis rolled the lab cart beside her and set down a printout of the PA amp's internal logs. Rudimentary, but present. Firmware keeps a start timestamp for last play, she said. It's not much, but it writes to a tiny EEPROM when a file begins. We dumped it with a clip. The value converts to Friday 6 hours 3 minutes and 11 seconds. 6:03, Isla said, letting it sit in the air like a buoy number. She wrote it on the paper in block pen. Loop initiates. Deva's report added the mechanical heartbeat. The loop length, 92 seconds, and the thin scratches of the inverter recharge cycle spaced every 23:14. The little fan with its tired bearing sang at those precise intervals like a kettle beginning to think about boiling. Your loop would run, Deva had said. Longer than anyone would tolerate living with it. How long on battery? Isla asked now, eyes still on the paper. Hollis tapped another sheet. Leisure battery rated at 100 amp hours, the inverter 90% efficient, the amp sipping 200 milliamps at the level we captured. Call it roughly 80 hours, given intermittent recharge from a piggyback off the freezer circuit. You'd get 3 days and a handful of hours without touching the mains. And they didn't, Isla said. They left the freezers on the grid to avoid an obvious spoilage event, then fed the inverter with a clandestine tap from the still-live freezer line so no patrol flip would matter. They controlled the lock on the cold room from that same private heart and forged a breaker tag so the scene would look responsibly dead. On the board, she made Friday into a narrow street and walked down it with a pen. 05:00. Owen arrives. Vestibule cam. Pre-overwrite segment. Box under arm. 05:42. Leona badges in. 05:45. 06:03. Audio prepared on site. Audacity project cache. Workstation headers. Mic in place. Chair positioned. 06:03. Loop starts. 3D.wave. With mask.wave under it for industrial camouflage. Priming.wave loaded as optional seasoning. 06:40. A photo on a cousin's phone. Later, much later, when they would tear that handset apart, would place Leona alive in the aisle, bound to the chair, the mic in frame. But Isla did not have that yet. She only had the hollow where it would soon fit. 09:12. An email from Callum Price to his broker. Disturbance at unit? Police involved? The timestamp didn't care if he was abroad. She looked at the line from 6:03 to the noon hour and felt the rails hum under it. He wanted response delayed, she said. Not stopped, because noise calls police. But if the noise sounds like a machine to anyone who pops a head in, they back out, call the owner, let it ride. They buy you time to do something else. What something? Hollis asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer by the way the inventory sheets sulked. Move stock, Isla said. Alter manifests. Use the quay when attention is turned toward sound, not toward doors. The dock road mass data for Stallard's phone sprinkled pings like breadcrumbs. Friday daytime at the unit, Friday night in a tight cluster around the back alley. Saturday afternoon making 2 small excursions to a petrol station where he bought diesel twice and returned to the alley, generator food. Sunday morning, same. Sunday night, a long stillness near the quay. He was feeding a Jenny, Isla said. Not for the amp, our battery could manage that with the freezer trick, but for tools. A reciprocating saw draws like a greedy dog. Put it on the Jenny. Keep it away from the building meter. Hollis slid over stills from a pole-mounted quay cam they'd pulled after discovering Stallard's loop had eaten their in-house footage. At 02:10 Saturday, an unmarked box then backed to the loading lip. The driver wore leather gloves over thin cotton liners that wrinkled at the wrists. He moved like a man who didn't much enjoy being watched by the sky. The pallet jack's fork flashed once in the sodium light. The van had no livery, a feature in itself. And the freezers stayed cold, Isla said. So a casual constable opening the door would feel a working plant, hear a scream buried in hum, and think, electrical fault. Shut the door. Call the name on the lease. Time continues. She flipped to Price's insurance thread. In the thread body, a question about police-mandated closure and spoilage cover. The broker's reply was crisp. Yes, for declared emergencies, subject to documented loss and mitigation. In drafts recovered from Price's laptop later, there would be a claim assembled Sunday night, time-stamped before the bolt cutters kissed the chain on Monday. In the present, Isla only had the email and the feeling of a hand sliding toward a till. What did Leona do from 6 to 8? Hollis asked, not unkindly. We have her badge at the door and her life evaporating into this timeline. Isla looked at the chair in the photo Hollis had just printed. The gouges, the lip prints dull cherry cresting the backrest like a tied line. She sat. She was made to sit harder. She screamed once for real, and we know that because the loop carries the ghost of lip smack and a chin bump on the mic ring. Stallard says she did one as a joke, and I believe him only as far as the first second. After that, intention enters. If you hold a mouth down and tell it to give you its vowel, you can get a clean, bright 92 seconds if you don't care what happens to the person after. Mask.wave, Hollis said, tapping the printout. The hum that made the scream sound like work. He named it Mask. No poetry in him. Poetry's for people who can live with metaphor, Isla said. They wanted function. She wrote the rest of Friday. The cold room door wired with the magnet and trunking. The drain seated with polymer beads that would swell in the damp air and burn a mouth away from its only leverage. The mop arcs beginning, careful and euphemistic. The PA's inverter hummed and recharged. The scream did not tire. The person could. Saturday, Isla said, and circled the time on the quay still. 02:10 van loading. Manifest fraud begins. Pallets of pharmaceutical precursors misdeclared. Price's cousin's shell rents the van. Stallard's bank sees a cash deposit Sunday. Stallard buys diesel twice. Hollis said, laying down the paypoint receipts. Cheap paper silvered with heat. Generators don't drink for free. While the neighborhood drinks the scream, Isla said, and the DVR eats its own tail on a 72-hour interval tuned to make Friday's dawn fall off the edge by Mondays. The scream is labor. It earns a delay. It earns a police closure. It earns an insurance claim. It earns 3 quiet nights to move product and to turn a person into a problem for water. She drew a thin line on the paper from the cold room to the interceptor tank, the shared square of concrete and bolts that sat under a metal lid outside between units 19 and 20. If you cut in the small hours, rinse, and chase with SAP beads and bitterant so the drain doesn't clog at the lip, you can get to the tank without the hull ever seeing red. Seal the lid with epoxy so the stink doesn't gossip. Hollis said nothing. The room had a sound like wool, the way silence can have nap. She placed the electromagnet's photos beside the receipts and the audio spectrogram, a collage of cold intentions. In the corner of the board, Isla wrote a phrase she hated for its neatness. The scream is concealment. Under it she added, because the case earned that too, the scream is alibi. Price will claim ignorance, she said. He will say Owen did the noise. He will point to his Valencia. He will talk about theft he didn't order, fraud he didn't sign. But he asked about police closure before the police came, and his shoes fluoresce with denatonium. Davis beads sting everyone who touches them, even days later. You don't get bitterant on your brogues in Spain. We'll need something that places Leona in his presence, Hollis said. A photograph, a trace in the van, a fiber. We'll get it, Isla said. It was not a promise. It was the tone she used to keep the team from drowning in the logic of cruelty. They went back to Warehouse 19 for one more pass before the evening crawl through the drains. The building had taken on that museum hush crime scenes get once you've named their tricks. Isla walked the aisle and counted the footsteps it took to get from the chair to the cold room door. She put her palm on the magnet's face and felt the sticky memory of pull in the cold steel. She knelt and breathed near the grommet. The faintest sting still lived in the rubber. Denatonium that refused to die with soap and time. On the quay, a gull landed and tucked one leg, making itself half a bird for the night. The river came up the stones, then drew back, like the weekend's pulse engraved in water. Isla looked at the pole camera's blind angle and imagined the van's rear doors yawning again. A pallet jack's prongs kissing the lip, the driver's cotton-lined gloves denying sweat to the nitral's diagnostic appetite. 2 jobs, she said to Hollis, who had come to stand beside her at the edge of the loading bay. A theft and a murder. The scream kept everyone busy enough to service both. And when it ended, Hollis said, the silence told the truth. Not all of it, Isla said. Next, we open the interceptor. If Leona went to water, she deserves to come back to air with a name. Behind them, in the failing light, Warehouse 19's louvers ticked one shy syllable. It wasn't human. It only knew how to rasp. But in the absence of the loop, the accidental voice sounded like a confession made by a building. We were made to work. We work too well. Theft is a quieter kind of violence. It has the same appetite for time. Hollis put the manifest stack on the table like a tranche of bad weather. The sheets wore Friday's date, stamped neat and bored. 19 pallets of pharmaceutical precursors inbound from Birkenhead, she said, to be cross-docked Monday. 10 are still here. 9 are paper ghosts. Isla turned pages with a gloved finger. Each pallet had a lot number, a batch code, and a destination hospital trust. The barcodes for the missing 9 all scanned to received, each with a handwritten tick in a tidy, unhurried hand. The warehouse management system showed the same. Inbound scans complete, storage locations assigned, everything tidy. Storage locations, Isla said. Show me the aisle and bay. Hollis tapped her tablet. Bay D, row 2 through 5. They walked to Bay D. The shrink-wrapped stacks stared back, tight and square, but the lot labels didn't match the manifest. Someone had relabeled 10 pallets with low-value stock, food-grade stabilizers, cheap plastics, and tucked the originals under layers of plausible plastic film. The hand that did it liked straight corners. Fraud by substitution, Isla said. Print new labels, Change the skew on the top layer. Leave the database happy. If no one opens the wrap, no one sees the theft till the lorry's gone. She pointed to the pallet jack scuffs etched into the concrete, hair-breadth lines that curved out of the row toward the loading lip, then were mopped over in a way that acknowledged them without admitting them. And if the neighbors and patrol are busy with a scream, then nobody checks a van, Hollis finished. We pulled Quay cameras outside the estate since Stallard set his DVR to eat its tail. There's a council poll cam that doesn't care about Owen's settings. The stills came up with the specific ugliness of sodium light. 02:10 Saturday. An unmarked box van reversing to the loading lip at Unit 19. No branding, no plates in frame on the still, but a smear that a video analyst would later tease into an alphanumeric with a patience that bordered on prayer. The driver stepped out, leather gloves over thin cotton liners that wrinkled at the cuff like paper. He moved with his head turned half away, as if the night had a face he disliked. Van rental? Isla asked. Shell company, Hollis said. Registered 2 months ago, 3 addresses deep. Director is a cousin to Mr. Price by a mother's side, different name, same Christmas table. We'll get there. They pulled 2 frames where the driver's sleeve rode up and showed a patch of wrist, pale and freckled. Hollis measured the man against the bay height and the van door and came away with a number that matched Price's cousin more closely than it contradicted him. Enough for a warrant. Not enough for a jury. Manifest edits ran Friday night, she went on. Flipping to the database audit log Deva had helped them wrench from a reluctant interface. User account, supervisor, changed lot assignments at 2218, 2226, and 2304. The IP matches the office terminal. It's not smart, it's lazy, which is fine. Lazy will do, Isla said. Lazy plus time makes money. They sawed into one of the high-value pallets that remained, with the owner's consent via a solicitor who kept saying abroad like a spell. Inside the shrink wrap and under the first tier of boxes labeled precursor, controlled storage only, was a stout heart of nothing. Empty boxes under an honest skin. The weight scanner, bless whoever had ordered it, had numbers that didn't match the manifest's expected tonnage. No one had bothered to recalibrate the scale. They needed the look, Isla said, not the mass. In the office, the printer tray showed a dusting of label liner scraps and a smudge of adhesive on the feed roller. On a back shelf, the label stock sat 1 box lighter than the inventory list. Hollis lifted the waste bin bag and teased out backing strips with fingerprints like tiny maps. She bagged them and didn't smile. Customs sent over an email chain at Isla's request that should have been routine. Import forms, proof of cold chain integrity, destination confirmations. Friday's forms had been completed cleanly, but the upload time didn't match the declared loading time by 1 hour and 12 minutes. It matters to no one, Isla said, unless you're counting hearts, and wrote it on the brown paper anyway. They brought in a logistics officer from the hospital trust to look at the labels. She touched one with the tip of a pen like it might bruise. If this shipment is short, operating theaters will start shuffling schedules by Wednesday, she said. These precursors go into things that keep people from dying of infection. If someone has diverted them, someone has, Isla said, not unkindly. We're putting them back. Stallard's bank belched a fact they could smell on him from the start. A cash deposit Sunday afternoon, bundled into an ATM that still had a camera that looked like a sullen fish. The video showed his shoulders and no face. The denominations were small, the stack thick. A man paying himself for weekend overtime with someone else's breath. Price, Isla said, has drafted an insurance claim. Sunday 2140, Hollis said, sliding over the draft from Price's outbox that they'd obtained with a happy warrant. The words sat like polished stones. Police-mandated closure, loss of stock, mitigation steps taken. The draft photo attachment slot was empty, as if he couldn't yet decide how much of the scream to show the men who cut checks. They widened the circle. The petrol stations where the diesel had been bought shrugged out their loyalty data. A man in a high-vis jacket with a hood up. Isla would have recognized Owen's gait in a fog. Fed notes into the till and carried the cans like pennants. The clerk, when asked, remembered nothing except the scream that had kept his customers jittery all weekend. 2 offenses, the CPS liaison said when Isla walked the theft parallel to the murder. Will you charge them separately? Conspiracy binds them, Isla said. We will plate the charges so one scheme colors the other. The scream is the knot. They went back to the van. DVLA blessed them with the plate after the analyst did the slow miracle of letter shaping and number straightening from the video blur. The rental firm's paperwork, when rated, showed a signature that was nobody's, a deposit that traced through 2 banks to the cousin's account, and return mileage that matched a journey to a temporary unit in an industrial estate 2 miles inland. Men had loaded pallets in the dark there too. A dog had barked and then remembered the treaty it had with its food. Inside that unit, once they'd brought the door down with a warrant and a crowbar, stood an echo of 19. Pallets rewrapped, labels covered with fresh ones destined for export. A reciprocating saw case stood open on a bench. The saw itself was gone. The foam remembered its shape. In the dust under the bench, a few saw chips glittered like fish scale. The chips were white, stinking faintly of preservative. They did not belong to wood. Ria's butcher's model fits the missing shape, Hala said, checking the catalog prints. Her lock was cut Friday night. The angle grinder dust in her unit was still fresh when we visited. Someone borrowed her teeth. On the floor of the unit, a small smear bloomed when they misted it, old, thin, the color of iron in a story. It wasn't enough to sing a whole song, but it hummed a key. The same dinatonium sting the beads in the cold room carried lived in its fluorescence. Someone had carried the bitter from door to drain to van to bench and not washed enough. Price's cousin came in looking tired enough to sleep on the custody bench. Under caution, he said he drove where he was told and that the nights were loud. Who told you? Isla asked, but he had the loyalty peculiar to families who didn't talk politics at Christmas. He shrugged, closed his eyes, and let the recorded silence pile like snow. All the while, Leona did not appear. She was everywhere in outline. The badge log's final figure, the lip print's dull cherry kiss, the cotton fibers in the drain, the 5 oily ovals on aluminium fins, and nowhere with a pulse. It made the theft look almost tidy by comparison, which Isla could not forgive. They took the intercept tank lid last because some doors you only open once. The bolts fought as if someone had recently loved them. Fresh epoxy flashed like teeth at the seam. The hydrojetters parked like a ferry boat and rattled the line. When the lid came up, a smell ancient and municipal rose, Fatberg and thyme, and under it the new note, protein, copper, glove powder. Floating in the gray soup were pieces that used to be a person's boundary with the world. Soft tissue not yet without identity. Clumps of cotton fiber like drowned thistle. The missing right nitrile glove, fingers puffed. With water. Partial dismemberment, Hollis said, her voice formal now, respectful on purpose. Tool marks to be matched. We'll sieve. We'll give her back a name. A gouge on a tank baffle had the neat, parallel chatter of a reciprocating sawtooth, like a comb dragged through cold hair. They cast it. They cataloged it. They did all the things the living do when they want the dead to testify. Back at 19, Isla stood in the aisle where the scream had been and numbered the theft against the life. 9 pallets gone, cash in Stallard's account, a draft claim in Price's outbox, a van that belonged to a cousin's shadow, a borrowed saw leaving its signature everywhere it kissed, a building taught to cry like a person so the people could cut and carry in the next room. It's clean enough to be obvious, Hollis said, and dirty enough to be true. We still have to put Leona in a room with them after 6, Isla said. We still have to marry the scream to the death, so neither can pretend to be single. On the quay, a tug let its horn off like a man clearing his throat after a lie. The foil on the louvers whispered in that disciplined way, a sibilant that remembered someone teaching it to be a throat. Next, Isla said, we pull on the beads and the breath, the gel and the lip. We will make the room speak in their voices, not in the one the machine learned. The lab made order from hurt. It always had that smell, solvent and late coffee and the faint metallic ghost that rides on the back of evidence bags. Hollis laid the first set of results on Isla's desk with the caution of a medic setting down a tray of instruments. "Drains first," Hollis said. "Your polymer beads." She tapped the report. Superabsorbent polymer, cross-linked acrylate. The mass spec peak stood like a skyline. 2 towers rose above the rest. "Denatonium benzoate present," she said. "Capsaicin present. Quantities are stupidly high for any honest purpose. Whoever loaded these wanted the gap to fight mouths, not moisture." Isla pictured the door seam, the rubber grommet, the cold. She didn't let herself picture the mouth. "Write it so a jury hears it," she said. They salted the only place a trapped person could put lips to breathe or shout, with a bitter ant that stings and a chilly resin that burns. They used the cold's own condensate to swell the beads and keep the torture fresh. Hollis slid the little vials across like chess pieces. Residues of the same on the grommet, the drain cover, and the inside lip of the door. And she didn't smile. She never did for this kind of win. "We swabbed Price's brogues. Trace denatonium fluoresced in the creases." He stepped in his own invention. "Good," Isla said, feeling the case's geometry sharpen a degree. "Now the hair." A second report, mitochondrial DNA sequence from the long blonde strand lifted out of the interceptor sample, matched a reference sample from Teresa Pace, Leona's mother. "High confidence," Hollis said. "Mito only puts her in the maternal line, but there are 2 more hairs from the drain cover bars themselves with usable nuclear DNA. We'll have STR profiles tomorrow." "I'm not waiting for tomorrow to think we found Leona in that pipe." "Neither am I," Isla said softly. "What about the mic?" Hollis set down a petri dish like a saucer with a sleeping star in it. Foam threads under low power, blue against the lab light. "Fibers from the PA microphone's foam windshield were found inside the cold room," she said, "clinging to the evaporator fins and one in the mop bucket sieve." She lifted a photo, the fins dull silver holding a bright synthetic thread like a hair plucked from a throat. "Your 3D dot wave carries plosive shadows and a chin ring click," she added. Deva overlaid those artifacts with a test tap on the seized mic. "They marry." Whoever recorded the scream did it with that microphone in that room with the victim's face on the chair. "Lipstick?" Isla asked. Hollis's mouth twitched, not with humor, but recognition of a detail that made a person feel present. "Backrest print is a vintage shade. Cherry Holt, discontinued 5 years ago. We found a half-used bullet in Leona's locker. Same label on the base, same pigment chemistry. Her mother gave us a photo from Easter. Leona wearing a dull cherry that matches the spectral read. We lifted a partial from the chair and compared. Ridge crossings, striation idiosyncrasies. Enough for a cautious consistent with the... "Let the CPS phrase the caution," Isla said. "I'll phrase the human." She pressed her painted mouth to the plastic because a hand was on her head. Hollis placed a sealed evidence bag on top of the paperwork. Inside was a slim, apologetic laptop with a cracked corner. "Stallard's machine," she said. "Forensics imaged the drive. The Audacity project for 3D dot wave is there with autosave caches stamped Friday 5/49 through 6/02. The default export settings, as Deva saw, leave a fingerprint. Same machine name in the header. Owen Stallard HP. There are also 2 audio downloads in his downloads folder, stock scream files. Timestamped 5/37. Isla let her eyes close for a beat, the way you might when a door finally admits the key you've been twisting. "Chain of custody tight?" she asked without opening them. "Tighter than a drum," Hollis said. "Logged from desk to bag to van to lab to image, hashes matching at every hop. There's no wiggle here." "What about the electromagnet fitment?" Isla asked, opening her eyes. Was that amateur or trade? Hollis had already thought about it. She placed photos beside the laptop, macro shots of screw heads, and an instruction leaflet with greasy fingerprints. "Install was neat, not professional," she said. "Pilot holes drilled with a cordless and a dull bit, wander marks on entry. The trunking is hand-cut with scissor bite. The cable glands are tightened with plier flats rather than a proper wrench. Ovalist. But the wiring diagram in the bin matches the unit we seized, and the page corner bears a thumbprint with a scar line across the pad. Stallard's left thumb has that scar. He fits the magnet. Price funds the power. 2 hands on the same door, Isla said. She took a breath that didn't feel like hers for a second, then pushed it out into the room where the case lay like a chart. The scream had been labor. Now the details were increments on the timesheet. Denatonium in brogue creases, capsicum in a drain lip, foam fibers and fins, cherry holt on plastic, 549 to 602 cached edits, 603 loop, 912 insurance email, midnight van, Sunday deposit, epoxy lid. Say her name, Isla said, and Hollis, who never used names lightly until she had a right, said it. Leona, she said. Leona Pace. They carried the reports back to 19 because sometimes you serve a building its own indictment. Isla stood under the dead ceiling speaker and read the humbler pieces aloud, like you might read a warrant to a door. Denatonium and capsaicin on the grommet. Hair consistent with Leona in the drain. Mic fibers from your windshield inside the cold room. Lip print consistent with her lipstick. Edits on Stallard's machine. Loop beginning 603. Magnet fitted by Stallard's hand. Price's shoes fluorescing the same bitterant he armed the door with. You were taught a voice to buy men time. The warehouse gave her its answer in the mute way of structures. A drip, a tick, an occasional foil-to-louver whisper. It sounded like a room trying not to remember. They brought Stallard back in with his solicitor and laid the laptop on the table between them like a small, expensive stone. Isla didn't raise her voice. This is your machine, she said. This is your project. These are your caches, saved in the minutes before your loop began at 6:03. This is the microphone we seized in your warehouse. These are fibers from its foam windscreen found inside the cold room. This is the lip print on the chair you set in front of that mic. He tried the first lie, the one where a man denies his own name on his own file. The solicitor's hand on his sleeve changed the shape of his mouth. He tried the second lie, the one where a man makes a joke small enough to fit in a pocket. Isla let them both pass like buses she didn't need to catch. Then she put the beads on the table. You seated the door gap with polymer loaded with denatonium and capsaicin, she said. You can say you didn't mean harm. The chemistry says otherwise. Stallard stared at the beads the way people look at hail on a warm day, as if the weather had betrayed them. Where is Leona? Isla asked, and the room felt colder than any cold room. Stallard's face moved through several lives and landed on one that might pass for honesty at night, but not in daylight. I left her alive, he said, barely audible. Price said he'd handle the door, because she'd agreed to keep quiet if we cut her in on a bonus. He told me to get the noise running and the cameras sorted. I came back midday to check the amp and she wasn't on the chair. The magnet was wired by then. He swallowed. I didn't open the door. Because you didn't want to see what your job looked like, Isla said. Sit with that. Price's call from Valencia came while they were still in the interview. He'd heard about the warrants through channels that rhymed with cousin. Detective, he said, smooth as laminate. I'm back in the country and ready to assist. Your denatonium says you never left, Isla said. We'll see you at Canning Place at 4. They took Leona's mother through the evidence like respectable thieves, lifting and showing, setting back. Teresa Pace touched none of it. She listened with that still, animal attention that mothers grow when the world threatens to talk about their children in the past tense. When Isla showed the lipstick and said the shade's name, Cherry Holt, Teresa nodded once, like a bell being agreed with. She wore it when she wanted to feel older than she was, Teresa said. Friday morning is early for that. Then, because grief is sometimes a ledger that needs balancing, she added, make the room say what it did to her. We will, Isla said. We can make rooms talk. We can make water remember. They kit the drain crew at dusk because the interceptor network runs like a private river, and the light matters to the way cameras see particulates. Hollis checked the sieves and the labeled jars. Deva, out of his comfort but stubborn, volunteered to place hydrophone mics for noise mapping so they could tell where sediment ran thick. Why sound? Isla asked, amused despite herself. Because everything is signal, Deva said. Even sludge. They lifted another lid, upstream this time, and found the same story in a different chapter. Cotton lint clotted in the trap, polymer beads swollen and angry, a fleck of cherry pigment caught like a tiny drowned flag in the grate. Hollis pinned it with a smile that had no joy and all the intention in the world. Drain is the primary disposal route, she said. We have proof of life by way of chemistry and fiber and breath. Next we give Leona back the map of her body. Tomorrow we bring the jetters and the sieves and a patience men don't expect from us, Isla said. Tonight we lock the doors and let the silence keep what it's keeping until we make it speak. On the way out, she paused under the ceiling speaker one more time. In the hush, she could still feel the shape of the scream in the room, like a bed that remembers the body it held. It was a wicked craft, what men had made here. A loop that turned breath into a tool, a door that taught a mouth to burn, a cold that kept hands from finding purchase and called it hygiene. She touched the recorder on her lapel. This will read in court like a recipe, she said softly. That's the only way to cook the horror out of it. Ingredients: polymer beads, denatonium, capsaicin, aluminium fins, foam fibers, cherry holt, audacity, 603, electromagnet, forged tag. Method: feed the inverter, loop the scream, lock the door, mop the floor, rename the pallets, write the claim. Serve cold. The louvers answered with their small, disciplined hiss. Outside, the Mersey lifted in the dark and set itself back down, a metronome for the work ahead. They opened the interceptor like a municipal secret, for bolts, each with epoxy shining in their threads. A lid that had been persuaded to be loyal. The hydrojetters set their truck hoses as if mooring to a quay, and the line thudded once as pressure woke inside it. The smell that came up when they broke the seal belonged to old kitchens and winter. Fat, soap, thyme. Under it ran a newer key. Protein, penny copper, glove powder. Even the gulls on the quay rails grew thoughtful and edged farther down. Record, Isla said, and the cameras blinked their little red eyes. The first pass was gentle, a low-pressure scour to loosen what had turned the interceptor into a throat with a secret. The jetters landside, and the water rolled back thick and gray. Hollis and the drain team worked the sieves like archivists, catching what the city would rather forget. Soft tissue came up in reluctant veils, water-blanched and threaded with cotton fluff. The cotton made clots like drowned thistle. A nitrile glove fingered its way out of the mouth of the sieve and lay there, the right-hand glove they'd missed at the door, turned inside out by water. "Tag it," Hollis said, and her voice wore the same care she used with glass. On the interceptor's baffle, a neat, parallel chatter marked the metal. A comb's worth of ticks that meant reciprocating teeth had kissed it. Hollis bent with the macro lens. "Tooth pitch for mill," she murmured. Chatter consistent with butcher's saw blades. "We'll cast it." The silicone set like a skin and caught the peaks and troughs in relief, the signature of a tool nobody would admit owning. "Again," Isla said. The second jet pulled more than fat. A ligature of hair twined around the sieve's wire like a line finding its cleat. Blonde, long, pale as thread plucked from a doll. Hollis lifted it on a glass rod and let the water drip from it like a sentence finishing itself. A fragment with the dignity of a name. In the jar beside the hair, a bead lodged in the mesh flashed as it turned. The translucent cylinder of a polymer gelda, still swollen and faintly gold with denatonium. One tiny cherry pigment fleck rode on the film of the sieve, stuck to a web of cotton like a flag that had come very far to be seen. "Enough," Isla said quietly. "We'll not clean the river with our hands today. We have what we need to speak." They laid the casts, the vials, the glove, the strands out on a tarpaulin beside the tank, each with its little ruler and tag. The dock's light had gone pewter. The river moved like a slow word in a cold mouth. Isla looked at the gouge on the baffle and let the scene arrange itself. A nightside man bracing a saw in a cramped chamber, blade biting, motor drinking generator current, a slurry of water and what used to be persons sliding forward to the city's throat. Time purchased by a loop. Evidence laundered by civil engineering. Rhea Doyle came to the tank because she had a right. Unit 20 shared its lid. She stood with gloved hands stuffed under her arms, jaw tight, eyes taking in what people have to know even when they don't want to. Is that my saw? She asked, voice packed with salt. Not the metal, the teeth. Too early to bless it, Hollis said. But the pitch fits your model's blades, and whoever took your saw cut the lock on your tool cage Friday night. The angle grinder dust inside your unit was fresh when we arrived on Saturday. Bright, not yet grayed by air. Ria's mouth turned a hard degree toward Price's closed roller door. And he'll say I took my own lock and loaned my saw, she said. He's a little artist that way. We'll account for every cut, Isla said. The drain remembers what men want it to forget. They pulled the back alley CCTV from a camera nobody bothered to ask for permission to look at, the traffic pole across the service road. Friday, 23:18. A figure in high-vis paused by Ria's door, body language furtive in the world's oldest way. A grinder flowered briefly with sparks that no one saw because the scream across the quay taught eyes to look away from light. The silhouette lifted a case out into the alley, put it on a trolley, and vanished into 19th shadow. The case's foam remembered the saw's shape when they would open it at an inland unit later, but for now Isla had the absence of the saw and the presence of its teeth in metal and meat. Inside Warehouse 19, the cold room waited with its square black drain mouth and its bent brace. They ran a borescope down the trap arm, past the first bend, into the line that sloped toward the interceptor. The bore's camera saw silt, cotton fluff, a flash of polymer bead, the small, appalling familiarity of tissue. It also saw a scrape line on the pipe's wall where something harder had passed, a scar slick with fat. The city is a body. Its pipes carry loss. Map the grid, Isla said. We'll pop lids at the upstream and downstream manholes and run the jetters again tomorrow at first light. Today we catalog what we pulled. That includes the saw mark and the glove. We are already more in this pipe than the men who used it thought we'd be. Hollis carried a little box across the aisle as if it might yelp. Inside lay the 5 gel lifters with the evaporator fingerprints, now dusted and photographed. Oily ovals that could be measured against anything they managed to lift from Leona's belongings or the mix housing. You'll have to tell them in court that warmth met cold, Hollis said. Tell them with science so they don't have to picture it until they choose to. I'll do them the cold courtesy, Isla said. Truth comes dressed in numbers. The rest is for their ride home. At Canning Place, the toolmark examiner took one look at the baffle cast and whistled under his breath. By late afternoon, he had a catalog match pegged to a butcher's reciprocating model, a brand common as knives. The chatter spacing set against a printed standard sheet sang a specific pitch. Your saw's missing, you say? He asked. Then we'll make do with its shadow. He handed Isla the overlay, a transparency with teeth like radio waves, and the cast in its cradle. Find me the blades from Ria's stock. We'll lay tooth to chatter and see if it's a wedding. Ria returned with a box of old blades from her cage, some with meat memory, some clean. Hollis labeled them like siblings at a family photo. Later, the laboratory would give them the marriage they wanted. 3 blades with wear patterns that, when spun against metal in a test rig, produced chatter lines the same distance apart as the baffle scar. Enough to say this kind of tooth did this kind of harm. Not enough yet to say this exact tooth. For today, Isla banked the almost. They took one more pass through the unit inland, the ghost of Unit 19 2 miles from the waterline. Under a bench lamp, the dust glittered again and gave up a single ridged fragment that wasn't plastic. Under a microscope, it carried osteon rings, bone cut surface smooth, one edge threaded by saw chatter. Hollis bagged it and wrote Leona in the space where the form said description, and then scratched the name out and wrote unknown female, because forms are dull and the dead deserve accuracy. Back in interview 2, Owen Stallard watched the nitrile glove in its bag as if it might reach for him. Isla let the quiet do a minute's worth of work. Right-hand glove in the tank, she said, gently as knives. Your left glove by the door. Your laptop on the table. Your magnet in the frame. Your inverter in the rack. Your voice on the project. Your money in the ATM. Who is your saw? Owen's solicitor lifted her head an inch, the universal sign for don't. Owen looked like a man who wanted to crawl into his own shoulders. I told you, he said. I left her alive. And who closed the door? Isla asked. Who seeded the gap with pain? Who cut the lock off Ria's cage at 2318? Who wrote an insurance email at 9:12 before anyone called the police? Who took 9 pallets at 2:10 Saturday? If you didn't do those things, Mr. Stallard, you stood very close to the men who did and sold them your hands by the hour. When they brought the sawcase foam into the interview room, a rectangle with a silhouette missing from it, Owen's eyes went to the absence the way children stare at a lost tooth. He closed them. Leona's mother asked me to make the room say what it did to her, Isla said. I'm making the room talk. It says you made it ready. Price came in later, no longer in Valencia. Smelling of the car air freshener men think is invisibility. His brogues had been swabbed before he sat. His cuff showed a powder bloom under alternate light. He arranged his face as if emotion were furniture. I'm devastated, he said, as if devastation had an invoice number. We found dinitonium in your shoe creases, Isla said. Beads in your drain. A draft claim in your outbox Sunday night, fully formed. A cousin with a van and council video with a plate that belongs to your shell. A tool mark in your interceptor that sings the same pitch as blades from the lock you helped make disappear. And a woman who is no longer in her mother's kitchen because your building taught a speaker to scream. I didn't, Price began, and then stopped because his solicitor's hand on his sleeve made a different shape with his mouth. You'll both be charged, Isla said. She didn't shout. She hardly moved. But before that, I want to know which of you locked the door. There's an electromagnet with your thumb in its wiring diagram, Mr. Stallard. There's dinitonium on your creases, Mr. Price. There are tool marks in a tank and blades in a box and a weekend full of noise tuned to the length of a theft. Neither man spoke. Sometimes men don't because every word in a certain light is a nail. Then we keep pulling, Isla said to Hollis in the corridor, while the doors breathed shut. We found Leona in the pipes. We found the teeth. Next we make the talk in those interview rooms decide who was hand and who was will. The quay was dark when they returned outside. The louvers clicked in a wind that smelled of tide and metal. Somewhere, far along the dock, a sheet of tin gave its single stubborn clank, like a clock that had 1 second it loved more than the rest. Low tide on the Mersey shows you the linesmen prefer to keep underwater. Isla set the interviews to start as the river fell, a private superstition about timing and truth. 2 rooms, 2 men, 1 story with incompatible centers. Interview room 1 * Owen Stallard. Duty solicitor present. Recorder ticking like a patient insect. Isla set the table with objects instead of threats. The Audacity project printed to paper like a storyboard. The magnet's instruction leaflet with the scarred thumbprint on its corner. A still of Leona's clock-in at 5:42. A photo of the chair's lip gouges and the cherry Holt smear. A close-up of polymer beads in a petri dish, annotated with dinitonium and capsaicin. The bank slip showing a Sunday deposit. No one objected to the display. Objects rarely do. We'll start after 6, Isla said. When the loop began to run without you. You said you left Leona alive. I did, Owen said, and the solicitor's hand twitched, as if even truth could be a blade. You wired an electromagnet to hold a safety door shut, Isla said, almost mild. Did you fit it before or after you asked her to sit? He stared at the leaflet with his thumb's ghost on it. After, he said. Friday mid-morning. I mounted the magnet. I tested it with the inverter. Price said it would keep the door from drifting. He said the old latches weren't rated if the plant shook. Your emails don't include plant safety, Isla said. She slid the draft of the insurance claim into the light. They do include police-mandated closure and spoilage cover. If you were only afraid of drift, why seed the door gap with burns and bitterness? Owen's eyes swam to the petri dish. I didn't load that, he said. When I went to lunch, early, just after 9, Price was on the phone in the office asking about policies. You went to lunch at 9, Isla repeated. Where? Caf on Dock Road, he said. Bacon, tea, 2 sugars. He added the sugar like salvation. Ask them. We have, Isla said. She didn't say what the CAF's camera had already given them. Owen in high vis at 9:21. a half-eaten bacon barm, his face a map of relief. When you returned? The amp was running smooth, he said. The magnet hummed. The DVR was quiet. Price said he'd handle the door. I took the van keys to fetch tape. He flinched at her eyebrows. Packing tape. Did you see Leona after 6:30? No, he said and swallowed. I didn't open the door. Because you didn't want to or because you couldn't? He found the point on the wall men find when they'd like to step out of their bones. Because I didn't want to know what Price meant when he said he'd handle it, he whispered. Isla let the silence take a minute and then gave him a smaller thing, one he could lift. Your deposit, she said, tapping the bank slip. Cash. Sunday. Who brought the cash? Owen's lips worked and then found an answer that fit in his mouth. Price, he said. He said it was overtime for keeping the plant upright while he was away. You knew he wasn't away, Isla said. She didn't wait for him to decide if he knew. She stood, took her objects, and moved to the next tide pool. Interview room 2 * Callum Price, solicitor present, a polish on the table you could see yourself in and decide to be someone else. Isla said a different arrangement. The shoe swab report fluorescing denatonium in the brogue creases. A still of 02:10 Saturday with the box van's plate teased into numbers. The Shell Company file with the director named Cousin. The council poll cam still of 23:18 Friday. A high-vis figure at Ria's tool cage, sparks like small fireworks. A map of the drain grid with the interceptor circled. The baffle cast with its combed chatter. You said Valencia, Isla began as if discussing weather. I was misinformed by my own diary, Price said, smiling without teeth. An assistant booked and canceled. Flights, you know. My mistake. You wore denatonium home, Isla said. The bitter ant you armed the door with. Your brogues remember what your mouth doesn't. I handle chemicals, he said easily. We're a warehouse. Denatonium could come from anywhere. It came from polymer beads in your cold room, Isla said. We found them in your drain, in your tank, on the grommet, capsaicin too. Unless your shoes do their shopping alone. You walked where a mouth had to burn to breathe. He shifted his gaze to the cast. What's that supposed to be? A saw's gossip, Isla said. Your cousin's unit inland has a bench that remembers a butcher model reciprocating saw. Your neighbor's lock remembers an angle grinder at 23:18 Friday. Your interceptor baffle remembers the chatter of a blade. Your draft claim remembers Sunday 21:40. My cousin is his own man, Price said, and my drafts are my risk management. If I'm charged because my supervisor did something dim with audio, your emails are curious risk management, Isla said. She slid the 09:12 Friday message across, the one where Price asked his broker about police-mandated closure before any patrol had rung any bell. You predict police involvement before there was any. You inquire about spoilage before the freezers blink. Your DVR is blessed to eat its tail in 72 hours, set by your supervisor at your instruction. You tell a man, handle the door. He wires a magnet. A woman disappears. A van arrives. A claim drafts itself on your machine like a fairy tale about loss. And your brogues taste like denatonium. Price worked his jaw as if dislodging a scale from a tooth. Detective, he said in his best businessman's register, I understand you're under pressure to solve a tragedy, but tragedy is not conspiracy. If Owen exceeded his brief, your brief, Isla said, gentle as frost, includes the words, please, don't, stop, layered under a scream and an industrial hum. Priming.wave and mask.wave, your kind of poetry. Your business model cries like a woman to buy itself a weekend. His solicitor's hand made the semaphore for no further. Price sat back, a man who'd like the room to reupholster itself around him. Isla left him with his reflection and joined Hollis in the observation booth. On the screen, Owen watched his own knuckles. Price watched the border of the table, measuring if the wood might forgive him. The river on the other side of the glass slid past the quay, a knife licking itself clean. Break them with each other, Hollis said softly. They're not friends. Isla nodded. She returned to interview one with a single sheet. A color print of 02:10 Saturday. The van at the lip, the driver's cotton glove liner rucked under leather at the wrist. She put it down like a coaster. "Who is this?" she asked Owen. He didn't look. "Don't know. Your phone pings in the alley while a generator drinks twice through the weekend," Isla said. "Your deposit arrives Sunday. Your magnet keeps a door shut. Your loop buys 3 days. Your laptop edits a woman's breath. If Price is the planner, you are the engineer. Planners don't beat back prison sentences. Engineers do, by telling the order of operations. I don't need your guilt to charge you. I need your sequence to crown him." Owen's solicitor opened her mouth. Owen spoke over her, small and fast, as if speed could make the sound pierce less. "Friday 6 o'clock, I asked Leona to sit," he said. "She laughed. I said, give us a scream." She did a short one. I boosted it with a stock file. Price came at 7-ish. He asked if the cameras were looping. I said yes. He saw the chair. He smiled like it was useful. He said he'd handle the door and that I should seed the seam. His words. He gave me a bag with beads and a bottle with a skull on the label. It stank like tonic and paint. I fitted the magnet at 9. He told me not to open the door after that. I didn't. I swear I didn't. "Did you bind her?" Isla asked. "I taped her wrists for the mic levels," he said. She said to stop. I took the tape off. "I did. Ask the chair. The gouges are from then." He pressed his thumb to his forefinger again, harder, as if he could abrade the memory off. "Price wired the bead feed while I was at the calf. He said the door gap was a weakness and that the bitter would discourage interference. He used that word, discourage, like it was a pigeon. "Who brought the saw?" Isla asked. "Price," Owen said, voice almost a cough. "From Ria's." He said, "We'll borrow the butcher's." I fueled the Jenny. He cut. I stayed outside. I didn't open the door. Isla stood, took the sheet, and stepped back into interview 2. "Your supervisor says you brought the saw," she said to Price. "That you seeded the seam. That you told him to loop faster, draft sooner, borrow sharper. He says you smiled at a chair like it was a tool. He puts you at the seam with dinatonium. He puts you at the lid with epoxy. He puts you in a room with Leona and a magnet humming." Price's face tried on outrage, then prudence, then an expression Isla had learned to respect in suspects. Strategic boredom, the one that says I will wait you out with my money. It lasted a count of 5. "If Mr. Stallard is seeking to mitigate his own." "Mr. Stallard gave me your word," Isla said, and slid a transcript line across the table like an invoice. "Seed the seam. It is not a common phrase. It is yours." Price glanced, then made the mistake of looking at the cast again. The small furrow between his brows that appeared at the word mitigation earlier returned at chatter. "Men can ignore ethics longer than they can ignore engineering. Your evidence is circumstantial," he said finally. "Circumstance is the shape a crime leaves when it thinks no one is looking," Isla said. "We are looking. We have dinatonium on your shoes, capsicum in your drain, a cousin's van on your lip, an email to your broker before any patrol cut any chain, and a woman's hair in your interceptor. We have your phrase in your foreman's mouth. We have your ledger hungry and a weekend built to feed it. And we have the scream you taught the room to sing." She let the recorder name the time and date and turned it off. Outside, in the corridor, Hollis stood with a printout she'd sprinted up from the lab. STR profile match on the 2 nuclear hairs from the drain cover, comparison against Leona's hairbrush. Match. Probability beyond the reach of any reasonable doubt. Hollis didn't smile when she handed it over. "Some papers are too heavy for that." "She's in the pipe," she said. "Buy the book." Isla took the sheet into interview 1 and put it down like a hand on a fevered head. "Leona Pace," she said, "is the woman in your drain. The loop you made kept her from help. The magnet you fitted kept her from air. The beads you introduced burned her mouth away from her only leverage. The saw your partner brought made her into pieces that thought they could pass for water." Owen's eyes filled and didn't spill. He put his face in his hands, and the solicitor touched his shoulder twice, not to comfort, but to confirm gravity. Isla carried the same sheet into interview 2. Price took longer to understand the numbers and shorter to understand the weight. His solicitor said the phrase "no comment" so many times it began to sound like a cough. At dusk, Isla stood outside on the quay and watched the river lay its teeth bare. The louvers on Warehouse 19 clicked, catching a foil edge, a tight, almost human syllable, and then the more honest hiss of wind. Low tide had done its part. The mud showed old lines and newer scars. Inside, the CPS liaison had their plated charges drafted: murder, conspiracy to commit theft, fraud, false imprisonment, abuse of a corpse, criminal damage. The case had stopped being a riddle and started being a rope. "Tomorrow," Hollis said at her shoulder, "we tie scheme to policy, make the loop and the claim the same sentence." "Tomorrow," Isla said, "we write the part about intention in ink they can't sand." The river took one long, cold breath and held it, the way rooms do when you turn off a machine that shouldn't have had a voice. By morning the case had a legal shape, but Isla wanted intention that read like handwriting. She started with the policy, the thin book that tells you which tragedies pay. The broker's office looked like a waiting room that had forgotten its patience. A man named Harcourt, tidy as a winter lawn, produced a copy of Price Storage Limited combined commercial policy and slid it across like a hymn book. Isla turned to the relevant psalm. "Clause 7.2, Harcourt said, tapping with a nail buffed to neutrality. Asterisk spoilage cover, deterioration of stock resulting from police or authority-mandated closure of insured premises asterisk, subject to declared emergency and documented mitigation." He glanced up, professional sorrow in place. "We require evidence that the insured did not cause the peril. Which is why Mr. Price asked you on Friday 09:12 whether police-mandated closure would trigger payout," Isla said. Before patrol had touched a chain. Harcourt looked surprised, then managed it down to interest. "We have that email," he said mildly. It raised eyebrows. "Raise them higher," Isla said, and handed him the draft claim from Price's outbox. Sunday 21:40 assembled before the cutter's kissed steel Monday morning. The subject line waited like an open hand. Claim, spoilage, police closure. The body read like a brochure. Noise disturbance, public nuisance, police attendance, closure by order. Refrigeration maintained for safety. Losses accruing from interruption to operations. She slid a second sheet over. Printer spool logs from Price's office showing Sunday 19/08/19 to 26 test prints of the same draft. Harcourt pressed his lips. He had the face of a man who disliked being used as a cog. "A claim prepared before the closure exists," he said. "Noted. Your testimony will say Clause 7.2 requires closure by authority because of the nuisance," Isla said. "We will say the nuisance was manufactured. The loop was engineered to be long enough to draw police and palatable enough inside to delay action. Mask.wave for industrial hum, priming.wave for suggestive whispers, and an inverter recharge glitch every 23:14 that only appears when someone understands duty cycles. A man planning a payout pays attention to minutes." Back at 19, Dava had the loop up on the lab wall again, the spectrogram scratch marks marching across like tally slashes. "Your 92-second loop is the base unit," he said. "No drift, no pant. Tuned, not sung. The 23:14 blips are the mechanical heartbeat of the inverter recharge. That's not accidental. It's someone who knows that intermittent loads ride more efficiently on cheap gear. It is an engineer's thrift." "Stallard's thrift," Hollis said, flipping through the Audacity caches. "Price's ambition." "Make it a sentence," Isla said. "Ambition hired thrift to build a nuisance the police would recognize and manage." They put that sentence on paper. The CPS liaison wanted every box ticked. The insurance word, asterisk closure asterisk, braided to the audio word, asterisk loop asterisk. The finance word, asterisk draft asterisk, braided to the forensic word, asterisk denatonium star. Hollis built a timeline board with a sternness that felt like respect. Asterisk Friday 05:37, 06:02. Stallard downloads stock screams. Edits in Audacity. Autosave caches stamped. Mike fibers later found in cold room. Asterisk Friday 06:03. Loop starts. 92S cycle. 23:14 inverter artifact. Asterisk Friday 07:00. Price on site. By testimony and pings. Cameras set to 72H loop. Breaker tag forged. Asterisk Friday 09:12. Price emails broker re. Police closure dash spoilage. Asterisk Friday 09:00. 10:00. Electromagnet fitted. Seam seated with denatonium plus capsaicin beads. Asterisk Friday night. Manifest edits. 23:18 neighbors lock cut. Saw borrowed. Asterisk sat 02:10. Van at dock. Pallets moved. Asterisk sun. Various. Diesel purchases for generator. Cash deposit to Stallard. Asterisk sun 21:40. Draft claim assembled on Price's machine. Printer spools show test prints. Asterisk mon. Police cut the chain. Loop still running. Claim ready to send. Prosecutors love motive that arrives on time, the liaison said, tapping 09:12 and 21:40. He's anticipating the closure, then banking it. Your loop is the bridge between them. They went one step duller, which is to say one step stronger. Forensic accounting. A technician with spectacles like a cartographer mapped Price's email drafts, autosaves, and metadata for system time drift. No backdating, he said, almost disappointed. He was confident. He wrote the claim early because the weekend was built to deliver the condition precedent. Nuisance that authorities would close. The draft includes phrases lifted from the policy itself. Clause 7.2's wording appears in quotation marks within his text. Quote me the bit, Isla said. The accountant cleared his throat and read, asterisk closure by police or civil authority, leading to deterioration of stock despite mitigation steps taken, namely maintenance of refrigeration plant during period of closure. Asterisk. Mitigation is doing a lot of work there, Hollis said. He kept the freezers on, and the inverter piggybacked that same line to run the loop and the magnet. Say that in court and then show them the piggyback clamp, Isla said. We'll bring the lamp too so they can see the scorch on the inverter's vent. If a juror can smell a plan, we've done it right. They interviewed Harcourt on the record. Under Isla's question, he read the phrases he would be happy to read to a jury. That nuisance not caused by the insured is covered. That intentional acts to create a closure void the clause. That preparing a claim before closure would be unusual. Isla replayed priming.wave at a whisper through his conference room speakers. Harcourt's face shut as if against weather. That, he said, is not mitigation. Neither are beads in a door seam, Isla said. They stapled the dull things to the vivid things. The lip print found its place beside clause 7.2. The baffle chatter cast sat under mitigation. The 23-14 recharge tick annotated engineered duration. The printer spool logs stapled to a photo of bolt cutters on Monday morning. The loop had been a machine in two economies. It purchased time for theft, and it promised money for silence. In interview 1, Isla brought Owen the policy. When Price said seed the seam and handle the door, he was using clause 7.2 as a prayer, she said. He needed police to close him. He needed your loop to call them and your magnet to delay them. He needed freezers humming so his claim could say mitigation. He paid you in cash. He will spend you in court. Owen's face went to a place empty of furniture. I thought the scream would keep people out, he said. I didn't think it would keep her in. That's the difference between tool and weapon, Isla said. Intention. In interview 2, Price affected the hauteur men rent when purchase is cheaper than remorse. Isla put the clause under his nose and read his own draft back to him. You used our presence as a line item, she said. You built a closure. You wrote to your broker that morning to see if the check would clear when we did our job. You kept your product cold so you could say the word mitigation while a woman warmed the drain. He tried one last edifice. No comment scaffold with regret. It wouldn't hold weight. Intention was now not just inference but habit, printed and cached and labeled like stock. By late afternoon, the charging package looked like a ledger with teeth. Isla added one more entry. Dava's spectral comparison showing that the loop's 92-second length corresponded to the period of the security contractor's patrol intervals on Price's service contract. Asterisk asterisk 2 minutes asterisk asterisk between vestibule checks on low staff hours. He tuned the loop not just to hold a pitch, Dava said, almost admiring in a way he apologized for. He tuned it to the way men walk. Put that in, Isla said. Intention lives where craft meets schedule. They took a statement from the security contractor to anchor it. Mr. Stallard asked for the DVR to loop to 72 hours on Friday. He cited drive errors. I warned of data loss. He signed. They added the breaker tag analysis. Font wrong, crimp wrong, printed Friday, and pinned it to the not our fault paragraph of Price's draft. The picture was not clever. It was clear. Juries don't need clever. When Isla finally sat down to write her memo of intent, the page she always gave herself permission to write after the facts could stand without it, she wrote in lines that tried not to wobble. Asterisk when a machine screams. Ask who taught it. Ask what their calendar looked like. Ask whose ledger waited with a blank where tragedy would go. If the loop hums in units of patrol routes, if the power lives where breakers cannot touch it, if the door learns bitterness where a mouth might go, if the claim writes itself the night before the chain is cut, then the voice isn't an omen. It's a plan. Asterisk. Hollis read the memo, nodded once, and went back to her lists. The CPS stamped the charges a step heavier. Fraud learned the adjectives it needed. By false representation, with intent to make gain. Murder learned the word joint enterprise. False imprisonment took the magnet's serial number like epaulets. They cleared one last thing before they went home. Press strategy. The scream had made the docs a rumor machine. We say recording, Isla told the comms officer. We say no longer a public danger. We do not say Leona until the family asks us to. We do not explain beads to the city. We let the building be quiet. On her way out, Isla stood under the dead ceiling speaker a final time that day and listened to the honest sounds. Drip, tick, the small foil hiss. Dava's 2314 ticks didn't live here now. Not without the inverter's heart. Neither did Clause 7.2's pathetic poetry. The river outside moved with its own policy. Ebb, slack, flood. Written long before men had learned to invoice grief. Tomorrow, Hollis said in the doorway. We take it to charge. Tomorrow, Isla said. And then we let a court learn what a loop can mean. The louvers took a little breath and let it go. Somewhere along the quay, a sheet of tin gave its single clank, a period at the end of a sentence that had taken 3 days to write. They charged them on a Wednesday. The river the color of tin and the gulls opinionated again now that the warehouse had fallen quiet. Paper did what paper does. Recorded names, marched offenses, set times. Callum Price. Murder, conspiracy to commit theft, fraud by false representation, false imprisonment, abuse of a corpse. Owen Stallard. Murder, false imprisonment, abuse of a corpse, criminal damage, and the same conspiracy that had made a weekend into an invoice. The charge room smelled of old carpet and new toner. Hollis handed Isla a bundle with the relief of someone who has carried a weight in both hands and finally put it down evenly. We'll keep adding exhibits, she said. But the spine's built. Spines matter, Isla said, thinking of the Interceptor's baffle cast and the chatter lines like vertebrae in silicone. They walked the case to the remand court like pallbearers who understood what they were carrying. The hearing was brief and procedural. The details would be for later. Price stood in his best gray suit with a tie that never learned humility. Stallard wore a borrowed shirt with the wrong shoulders. When the clerk read Leona Pace aloud, the room changed temperature in that way rooms do when a name reaches its proper mouth. Teresa Pace sat 3 rows back, hands folded in her lap, Cherry Holt on her lips not because anyone had asked her to, because the dead sometimes arranged the living's colors for a day. After, in the corridor where the paint had learned too many seasons, the CPS liaison said the tidy words that meant movement. Full file by Friday. Witness conferences next week. Will run with joint enterprise and conspiracy braided. Audio and policy together. Together, Isla said. That's the only way the loop means what it meant. Back at Warehouse 19 they finished the last of the dull work, the best kind. A survey of the inverter line showed the piggyback clamps bite and tiny scorch freckles where a cheap plug had heated under honest load. They measured the electrolock's pull against the door seal with a spring gauge that read out in the grammar of kilograms. They redid the room tone capture with the louvers taped back to their exact found angles, in case any defense expert wanted to hear how a building was taught to rasp. Deva rebuilt his chain of custody folder with a cleric's neatness and added one late flourish. A short reconstruction of the loop stripped of the mask.wave hum and priming.wave whispers, the way 3D.wave would sound on its own in an empty world. An engineered vowel holding 480 Hz like a man holds his breath underwater. When he pressed play for Isla, the noise came out of the lab speakers like a blade held steady over a vein. Then he added the vent rasp and the hum, one fader at a time, and the sound turned from horror into work. What people heard, Deva said, was a choice. Most cruelties are, Isla said. The Toolmark report returned with the phrasing that investigators learned to love. Consistent with 3 of Ria's spare blades, when mounted in a test rig and drawn across mild steel, produced chatter spacing matching the baffle cast within acceptable tolerance. The fingerprint on the magnet leaflet's corner put Stallard's scar in black powder where only his word had been before. The printer spool logs got a friend. A thumb grease print on the underside of the draft claim's final page, the whorls smeared with a faint fluorescence that Lab said was denatonium residue. Hollis, who had stopped smiling a week ago as a professional courtesy to grief, let herself breathe out at that one. You can stand in front of a jury and tell them this man touched bitterness and paperwork at the same time, she said. They'll understand that. Teresa came to walk the scene once, by rights, by invitation, by a kind of ritual some officers forget and some never will. They did it when the press were downriver and the dock gates were lax. A morning with low cloud and a wind that couldn't decide. Hollis taped plastic over the worst of the cold room's corners. Respect, not censorship. And they let Teresa stand in the aisle by the chair without hurrying her. She reached out and touched the lip gouges without touching them, the way you do to a memory behind glass. When she spoke, it was not a question. She was brave, Teresa said. Yes, Isla said. It was a kind of oath. Teresa looked up at the dead speaker and then at the louvers with their foil ticks. You'll turn it off properly, she said. It's off, Isla said. And if it ever tries again, we'll hear it. Teresa nodded, and they stood in that cold aisle for what counted as a moment and then a minute and then something without a number. By the time press conference day arrived, the story had already written itself in the way stories do when a city has been listening to a single noise for 3 days. Isla kept it human and small. She said recorded, not haunted. She said no ongoing public danger. She used Leona's name because Teresa asked her to. She did not teach the city the words denatonium or capsaicin. She did not say Cherry Holt. She did not describe beads. She did not make the drain into a theater. She said, our thoughts are with the Pace family. We have 2 men charged. We ask for your patience and your kindness to the family as the case proceeds. A journalist who had spent the weekend inventing folklore tried to ask if the scream could have been a message. Isla answered as if he had asked about the weather. It was a loop, she said. It was designed to sound like a machine inside and like distress outside. It bought time. It will not buy freedom. The days between charge and committal are always elastic. Work stretches to fill them. Hollis finished her comparative charts, lip print traits aligned to Easter photos, hair metrics mapped to brush samples, SAP bead chemistry annotated to supply chains. The security contractor signed his statement about the 72-hour loop with a pen that leaked. The chandlery clerk practiced saying Owen Stallard without flinching. The petrol station clerk remembered the 2 cans and the way the scream made his countertop glasses hum. On a Thursday, a diver in a dry suit fished a recipe saw from the canal behind the inland unit. Water had tried to forget it. Metal had tried to remember. The cereal had been scratched shallowly, as if someone had lost his nerve. Tool marks on the blade carrier matched where on Ria's spare blades. The grease in the hinge fluoresced under the same alternate light that made Price's brogues tell their little bitter truth. Hollis bagged the saw and wrote the new number in a line that had room left for it. Price's solicitor tried for bail with the kind of speech money buys, a flourish of adjectives around businessman, community, shock. The magistrate's voice cut in like a straight edge. Charged with murder and conspiracy, she read. No, Stallard's application failed on gravity alone. They went back down the steps handcuffed, one pacing, one shuffling. Men take chains differently. On a quiet evening, Isla wrote what she calls a memo for herself on a single sheet. Something she never files because it doesn't belong in evidence and does belong in a person. She wrote in the second person because sometimes she needs to instruct the part of herself that turns buildings into sentences. You walked into a room taught to scream and turned off a machine. You counted drips and ticks and let the silence tell you where the lies were. You asked a river for the parts of a person and it answered in the language of pipes. You learned that some men like to make disaster to fit a clause. You learned again that a mouth held down to a microphone can be made into a tool. Do not forget the difference between a signal and a life. Do not let your craft turn into their craft. When she folded the page, she found the corner had smudged with lab dust. She left it as it was. Committal set a date with a seriousness that courts keep even when the walls need paint. Teresa came, sat, stood, and left with the dignity that makes rooms straighten. Outside, the river made its cold argument with the tide. Inside, Hollis tucked the last exhibit list into its spine with a pat that was almost fond. Deva carried a case labeled audio. Master like a priest with a small reliquary. The toolmark man wrapped his casts as if they might catch a chill. On the last day Isla needed to be in Warehouse 19, she walked it alone. Procedure allowed it. Sentiment required it. The tape had come down and the racks had been sold to a man who liked to buy things with a story and tell it wrong in his head. The ceiling speaker stared like an old coin in plaster. The plastic chair had gone to the lab, never to come out again. The cold room was bolted with a sincerity it hadn't known in months. She stood under the louvers. A mild wind came off the Mersey and bent their foil tongues so they whispered in a way that no longer wanted to be a throat. She took one sliver between gloved fingers and peeled it gently. Came away with a sound like a small apology. Outside, the quay wore the scuffs of new work. Forklift tires, the chalk of a number against brick, a coffee cup taking on the geometry of the wind. Isla leaned on the rail and watched the river receive the day's light without comment. The scream, which had once seemed to carve itself into the stones, was just a story now, folded into exhibits and sworn lines and numbers that would make a jury nod. It had not been an omen. It had been a machine set to 92 seconds, tuned to 23:14, engineered to be a wage for theft and a mask for murder. She thought of Teresa's cherry holt and of Leona's long hair twisting around a sieve wire like a line finding its cleat. She thought of the moment in interview 1 when Owen's mouth had finally told the order of operations, and of the way Price had flinched not at ethics but at engineering. She thought of the magnet's quiet, stupid strength, and of the drain that had lied like a good drain does, carrying away what men ask it to carry until someone makes it tell. In her report, she wrote one last line and didn't read it aloud to anyone. Asterisk case closed. When a machine screams, ask who taught it. And when the machine stops, listen to what the room kept breathing for it. Asterisk. At low tide, the louvers clicked once. Clean metal against clean air, and then were still. The river kept the echo, not the reason. The warehouse is silent now. The scream, looped, engineered, bought and sold, has ended. But silence is not peace. It is only what's left when evidence has spoken. Detective Isla Kerr filed her last memo with the weight of numbers and dates. But behind them stood Leona Pace, a voice turned into a machine and then into proof. The city along the Mersey will forget the sound in time. The river will not. Thank you for staying with us inside those cold aisles, those drains that lied, those 3 long days of a scream that would not stop. Your attention is what keeps these cases alive, even when the voices have been stolen from them. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more gripping audio stories.